Yes, that is fine.
Okay, and here it says, Dr. Mike Yeadon has a degree in biochemistry and toxicology and a research-based PhD in respiratory pharmacology. He has spent over 30 years leading new medicines research in some of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, leaving Pfizer in 2011 as vice president and chief scientist for allergy and respiratory. That was the most senior research position in this field in Pfizer. Since leaving Pfizer, Dr. Yeadon has founded his own biotech company, I think it's pronounced Ziarko, which was sold to the world's biggest drug company, Novartis, in 2007. So you do have an impressive background. Is there anything you would like to add to that?
No, except that having sold Ziarko, I didn't retire, but I now consult to other startup companies. So I help the management of small biotechs. So I have clients around the world. I'm very lucky. And I have one that I can state publicly. Unfortunately, I suddenly blanked on the name. Yes, the company is called Kineset, K-I-N-A-S-E-T, Kineset Therapeutics in Boston. And they've just succeeded in raising quite a lot of money, $10 million. And they will be making press releases on that achievement, and they will mention me as one of their advisors. So I wanted just to let you know I still advise to biotech, so I'm still current. I just don't work for any employer anymore.
Okay, let me just translate this because I'm not sure if our simultaneous translation is working yet. So I'll take over. Also Dr. Mike Yeadon hat einen absolut beeindruckenden Hintergrund. Er hat einen Grad in Biochemie und in Toxikologie, hat einen Doktortitel in Atmungspharmakologie, wie man es genau übersetzt, weiß ich auch nicht so richtig. 30 Jahre war er in neuen Medizin, in der Untersuchung von neuen Medikamenten unterwegs, in den größten Pharmaindustrien der Welt und ist 2011 bei Pfizer ausgeschieden als Vice President und Chief Scientist. Er hat eine eigene Firma gegründet, Ziarko, die hat er verkauft an Novartis, ist aber immer noch aktiv im Feld, hat eine weitere neue Firma und ist da immer noch als Berater unterwegs, hat also aktuelle Kenntnisse über das, worüber wir hier sprechen. Und was mich sehr beeindruckt ist der Anfang seines letzten Aufsatzes. This is really, I really like this quote you gave here. It's easier to fool people than it is to convince them that they've been fooled. Mark Twain. And that's exactly what we're talking about right now.
That is the problem.
Yeah.
I was in conversation today with a PhD doctor I have known for 35 years since university, and I'm still struggling to persuade her of what I'm going to talk to you today. Mm-hmm. And it shows, and the reason is we haven't spoken for maybe a year, and so she has absorbed what the media has told her, and which is that we have 30,000 new infections every day, and that people are dying, and she's naturally connecting those two things. And I will tell you that they're no longer connected. So there are these PCR false positives, and there are some deaths, but they're not connected. At this point, the virus is not killing people. Mm-hmm. So yet, nevertheless, the PCR machine is providing frightening numbers, and it's keeping people fearful, in masks, locked down. For me, I think that's its purpose.
And we believe the same thing, because that is the conclusion that we have arrived at after hearing so many experts from all over the world since July 10th, by the way. And none of them is in any way even remotely damaged. None of them can be put into the category of conspiracy theorists. But the biggest problem, you just alluded to it, is the mainstream media, which the very same people who invested their money into the pharmaceutical and the tech industry also invested money into in order to make this plan work. And I looked at your article, What SAGE Has Got Wrong. SAGE, can you briefly explain what that is?
Yes, of course. So SAGE stands for Strategic Advisory Group for Emergencies. And basically, it's a group of scientists. It's meant to be the best scientists that we could have, that the government of the UK would turn to if there's an unusual emergency. But the problem, and they're probably a very good group of scientists mostly, but the problem is they have not handled this particular early in the year with the imminent arrival of this new virus. They set about creating a computer model, a mathematical model, to try and estimate what would happen. And they used the infection or case fatality ratio estimates from China, which were very high. And I'll come back to that in a moment. They were not seeing very many patients, but mostly they were very ill and then they would die. So the impression was gained of a very, very lethal virus. That's one thing. The other thing is they had not a single immunologist. I'll say it again. In their 100-member committee, not one cellular or clinical immunologist. I was appalled. I didn't know this till July. So they didn't have anyone even as amateur as me at immunology. But all of the statements I make about immunology, I've got from my 1981 undergraduate textbook written by Professor Ivan Reut, who is probably the most famous immunologist in Britain. He's still alive, he's 97. And so everything I say about surviving infection and becoming immune, we knew this when I was small, and it was old news then. So when people say, oh, you're making claims, the science isn't this advanced, and I have to tell them that I hold up my undergraduate textbook and I say it's in there. And then they look a little surprised. Anyway, so SAGE is an advisory committee for government, and I assert that it didn't have people with the right skills to properly assess what was coming towards them. So they assumed, I can see Professor Wodarg. I'm honored to be in your presence, sir. I've listened to your testimony and I'm a long way behind you. So you will be surprised, Professor Wodarg, when I tell you that the logic group of physicists and mathematicians on SAGE, they used to estimate how many people would die. They said, this is a new virus. Consequently, there will be no prior immunity in population. It's just, I fell over when I read the report. So you should understand that it may be a new virus, but nothing comes from nothing. Everything is related to everything else. And then when I heard it was a new coronavirus, I immediately went to the sequences to find out how related it was to other things. I was reassured that there was some similarity with many common cold-causing coronaviruses, and I reassured myself everything would be fine because there would probably be a high level of prior immunity, and that's true. But SAGE says there's no immunity, so that means everybody, 60% would have to be infected or 70% before herd immunity. And then they assumed that maybe 1 in 30 would die, which is crazy. It's maybe 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 500. So you can see already the numbers. What else do we do? Those are the main ones. Okay. They said it was much more lethal than it is, and they said almost everyone is vulnerable, which is not true. And so their estimate was that 500,000 people will die. And so immediately the country panicked because our political leaders are all what we would call classics and humanities graduates. None of them have any science, technology, engineering, or medicine. So they were told by SAGE that this disaster is coming and you must all hide. And so that's what they did. And that was the start of the disaster. And nothing has changed. We've still got the same Prime Minister who has a degree in Greek studies. And we have as health minister someone who has a degree in politics, I think. That's it.
Same here in Germany. Same here in Germany. Let me briefly.
It's unbelievable.
Let me briefly translate.
So that's SAGE.
Ja, also SAGE ist eine spezielle Beratungsgruppe, die die Regierung für Notfälle, für Emergencies bereithält. Und er sagt, da mögen ja schlaue Leute sein, aber das sind nicht die Leute, die man braucht, um in einer solchen Pandemie vernünftige Ratschläge zu erteilen. Ich frage das jetzt gleich nochmal genau nach, aber ich denke, dass ich da nichts übertreibe, wenn ich sage, dass die hier eine Truppe von Mathematikern überwiegend zusammengezogen haben, keinen einzigen Immunologen dabei, Mathematiker, die Modelle berechnen. Und diese Modelle, haben mit der Realität, so sagt er es, überhaupt gar nichts zu tun. 2 grobe Fehler sind da gemacht worden, auf die wir gleich noch kommen. Ich will nur einmal noch kurz nachfragen. So what you're saying is that this group of people, which includes no clinical immunologists, but a lot of mathematicians, are basically a modeling group. And what this then boils down to is that they can be seen as seers, those who can foretell the future, but they have no relation with what's really going on, and in particular with this particular crisis, right?
Yes, that's completely accurate. There's a little bit more to say. I think 2 things that are shocking. So I have spent the last 6 months, I would say, criticizing the science, the techniques that have been used, and the conclusions that have been drawn. I try not to criticize individuals because I don't know them and I don't know their motives, but I can judge what they say and what they do as against what would be reasonable given the situation. So I will tell you that Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College London leads the modelling effort that you've just described, Rainer. And I don't know him at all, but I do know that his track record of predicting the scale of medical and veterinary emergencies is not very good. And interestingly, I think, I didn't realize it till this year, on every occasion, his estimates have been too high, sometimes by between 10-fold and 100-fold too high, every time. And there are 5 or 6 famous examples in the literature that relate to human infectious diseases, including one I'm sure that Professor Bodag is familiar with, but also things like foot and mouth disease spreading amongst farm animals and other things. So he has a tendency, I think, he calls it the precautionary principle. He has a tendency to set all of the variables to the, as it were, the worst end, and then you run the model, and of course it produces very frightening predictions, which are always too high. And his defense is, well, I didn't want to be wrong on the low side. But I would say that it's not precautionary to give people information that's so far from reality that they end up doing things that are reasonable if your predictions are correct, but wrong, damaging, and indeed lethally damaging if they're, in fact, if the predictions are wildly wrong, which they are. So that's one thing I will say about the modelling group led by Professor Neil Ferguson, who, by the way, for anyone listening, you would think that if he's modelling epidemics, pandemics, he would at least have some training in infectious diseases, maybe virology. You would hope something about immunology, something like this, detection methods. No, the man, his training is in theoretical physics.
Oh, we have a very similar situation. I think the situation, by the way, is more or less similar all over the world, and probably not by accident, because we here, as our Secretary of Health, have a banker, and our Chancellor, of course, is a physicist. Let me, again, briefly, before maybe we can talk about those 2 basic flaws that they assume here. Let me again briefly translate this. Also sagt, die Mitglieder dieser Emergency-Gruppe sind überwiegend Leute, die von dieser konkreten Situation nicht den Hauch einer Ahnung haben. Er drückt sich da wesentlich zurückhaltender aus, als ich es gerade tue, weil eben keine klinischen Immunologen darunter sind. Es sind Mathematiker überwiegend und die sind so eine Art Wahrsagertruppe in diesem Zusammenhang, liegen vollkommen neben der Realität. Warum das so ist, wird er uns gleich erklären. Der Chef dieser Gruppe ist Neil Ferguson vom Imperial College. Er sagt ausdrücklich, er kennt den Mann nicht und deswegen kann er über ihn persönlich nichts sagen. Was er aber sagen kann, ist, dass er dadurch auffällt, dass er eigentlich mit allem, was er jemals gesagt hat, daneben liegt. Genauso wie unser Professor Drosten hat er schon in der Schweinegrippe ein 10- oder noch mehrfaches der tatsächlichen Risiken vorhergesagt, die da nie eingetreten sind. sodass man im Ergebnis sagen kann, mit Hilfe dieser Aussagen wurden und werden jetzt wieder Menschen dazu gebracht, an furchtbarste Szenarien zu glauben, sodass sie eben alles das mitmachen, was man ihnen vorschlägt, um diese furchtbaren Szenarien, Hunderttausende, Millionen von Toten zu vermeiden. I just explained that they're using these wildly wrong estimates. By the way, same here in Germany with Professor Drosten, who through the WHO and in collaboration, as we can see with Neil Ferguson, is trying to scare the hell out of the world. But okay, go ahead. Maybe we should talk about those two basic flaws in their assumptions.
Yes, we can do that.
Or what would you like to talk about first?
Yes, I wanted just to complete just a very brief description of SAGE. Yeah. So far we've talked about the mathematical modeling group led by Professor Neil Ferguson, but that's only one of three sort of subcommittees of SAGE. So the first one is modeling, what's going to happen, how many people will be infected, how many deaths, and so on. But there are two other groups. The first is you may be familiar with it because the WHO has the same, and it's called the non-pharmaceutical interventions group. Yeah. So when a new disease arrives, reasonably enough, they will say, well, we don't know how to prevent it or treat it initially. So how can we mitigate it by using non-drug methods to help people not become infected? And so you get the familiar, now familiar, I'd never heard of these, now familiar things like lockdown, a word I've never heard of except in a prison drama, but I've never heard of it before. So lockdown is one method that this non-pharmaceutical interventions group, it's a subcommittee of SAGE. I will say, I may confuse things, but I'm not going to name names because you'll be able to find them out. But the interesting thing is that there's a small group of people, I think it's 7 or 8, no more. SAGE has 100 scientists, but there are 7 or 8 only. They appear on every one of these subcommittees, and they also appear in all the press statements when they're standing next to the ministers. So if you wanted to if you wanted to imbue any of this stuff with motive, you would be able to see how it would be done because it's the same small number of people. Anyway, so the second group, the first group is modeling, the second the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And their job was to work out what measures could be taken in order to protect the population. And I'm mentioning it because we are in it now. We're in it in France, we're in it in the UK. We call it lockdown or restrictions. It's the same group that also said, well, if we can't prevent you catching the disease, if we can't treat you, what we'll do is minimize the chances you'll catch it. So we'll make you wear masks. And that's an intervention for which I knew there was no evidence it would work. I've spent my entire life working in deposition of respirable particles into the pulmonary tract of humans and animals. So when I heard that you should be using masks, I knew that was a stretch, shall we say. Mm-hmm. So, but that's a protection method that this team recommended. And then the other one is the rather dystopian phrase, social distancing. I'd never heard of this phrase either. So yes, lockdown, masks, social distancing, and there are probably other things. Oh yes, restricting certain shops and normal business and social activities. So this thing, and their group seemed honourable enough, but you can see the work product, I think, is deranged because I've read through the recommendations and then I've looked for the scientific evidence that underscores their usefulness, given that all of them are very disturbing to the economy, and worse than that, they lead, I think, directly to deaths because the population no longer has good access to each other and to healthcare services. So all of these measures, I wanted them to be supported by strong evidence, and they're not. So I've read all their reports. Their reports have been made public, although they were secret. They were made public because a businessman brought the government to court to say that these measures were unconstitutional and unreasonable. And part of the court case involved forcing SAGE to reveal all of its minutes to that day. And so we are privileged to be able to read all the minutes, and very entertaining they are. So that was the second group. So Rainer, perhaps I'll let you describe that to your colleagues, and then we'll come to the third group, and then that's frightening as well.
Thank you. Also, es gibt eine Untergruppe in dieser SAGE-Gruppe, also in diesem Notfallberatungsgremium, das aus insgesamt 100 Wissenschaftlern besteht, wie wir eben gehört haben, überwiegend Leute, die von dem, was hier betroffen ist, keine Ahnung haben, Mathematiker, letzten Endes Wahrsager, die versuchen irgendwie vorherzusagen mit irgendwelchen Zahlen. Auch Neil Ferguson übrigens, ich glaube Physiker, wenn ich es richtig verstanden habe, Leute, die gewohnt sind, Zahlen zu benutzen, und wie wir eben nochmal gehört haben, hier jemand mit Neil Ferguson, genauso wie bei uns Herr Drosten, jemand, der eine Tendenz hat, immer maßlos zu übertreiben und die Welt in Angst und Schrecken zu versetzen. Es gibt eine Untergruppe, die ist für die nicht pharmazeutischen Interventionen da, wenn eine neue Krankheit, eine neue Pandemie am Horizont erscheint. Und diese Gruppe, er sagt, ich nenne jetzt keine Namen, aber man kann sie ja jedes Mal sehen, wenn sie aktiv werden, besteht aus 7 Leuten. Und diese 7 Leute stehen auch immer, wenn eine neue Maßnahme verkündet wird, in der Regel neben der Regierung. Und diese Leute haben unter anderem empfohlen den Lockdown, von dem Mike Jeden noch nie vorher irgendwas gehört hatte, außer in einem Film, den ich übrigens auch kenne. Ich glaube, mit Sly Stallone ist der Film. Und dann natürlich die Masken und das sogenannte Social Distancing. Für alle diese Maßnahmen, sagt Mike Jeden, gibt es 0 Evidenz, dass die in irgendeiner Weise irgendwas bringen. Nichts. Im Gegenteil, sie sorgen für Tote, weil die Menschen sich nicht mehr nah genug sind, weil die Menschen nicht in der Lage sind, auf benötigte medizinische Maßnahmen zuzugreifen. Gerade das Social Distancing zerstört all diese Möglichkeiten, auch miteinander zu kommunizieren. Darauf hat er eben kurz hingewiesen. Okay, so.
Okay, then the third group, if there are others I don't know about them, but there is a third group. I'm not sure what its formal name is, but the easy way to understand it is psychological operations. Basically, the psychological operations group is replete with psychologists and people who understand motivation and fear and so on. And their job, their legitimate job, I think, was to make sure that in an emergency, that the government had at its disposal every single tool to get the public to do what the government wanted. You could understand, I do understand this, it's the reason it exists is legitimate, because if an emergency was announced and lots of people didn't believe it, they would just go, well, I'm not going to do what you tell me. And so this group exists frankly, is to raise the fear level. And it even says so in one of their minutes. It says, it seems from our survey that most people do not feel sufficient personal threat, and therefore we need to increase our methods, which I found chilling.
I do too.
So I'll just stop and so you can describe it. I don't really know anything about them. It's not my field, but I wanted your colleagues to know that it is and what they are doing.
I think it's extremely important, because that is the level on which this is the playing field, really.
Yes.
Also er sagt, es gibt eine dritte Gruppe, die ist für Psychological Operations, also für psychologische Operationen zuständig. Da sind natürlich Psychologen drin, die dafür ausgebildet sind, Leute zu motivieren, zu steuern. Hier in diesem Zusammenhang auch die Leute notfalls in Angst zu versetzen, ich würde sagen in Panik zu versetzen. Deren Job ist es, in einem Notfall die Menschen dazu zu bringen, das zu tun, was das Government für erforderlich hält. Und wir haben eben von ihm gehört, dass da exakt das Gleiche geschehen ist, wie das, was hier aufgrund des sogenannten Panikpapiers geschehen ist. Nämlich, es wurde in den internen Instruktionen darüber gesprochen, dass es sehr wichtig ist, den Angst- oder Paniklevel zu erhöhen. Die Menschen hätten noch nicht Angst genug. The very same thing happened here, Mike.
Wow.
There was a paper that was leaked by the Secretary of the Interior. I mean, he didn't leak it, but it was produced at that institution, and it explicitly calls for making little children feel responsible for their parents' or grandparents' tortured death if they do not adhere to the measures. That is definitely terrible. Chilling. Yeah,
but exactly, that exactly fits. Yes, we have the same sort of thing. The phrase that has been used. There are lots of phrases. You see them. When one of these phrases when you know it comes from SAGE, it suddenly appears from nowhere. You've probably never heard it before, and you hear it from every TV channel, radio station, and newspaper the next day, and you keep hearing it. So once you are alert to this, I'm not paranoid. I've just literally taken notes. I thought I've never heard that before. And just one example, it's separate from this conversation, but very related to the matter at hand. So when the Great Barrington Declaration was launched, and I would say they were a very courageous group of people who we have a phrase in Britain, a statement of the bleeding obvious. You know, it basically is a sarcastic phrase to say, well, yes.
Yeah.
So basically they stated what is well known, which is that some people are immune, and when they are infected and recover, which most they do, they are also immune. And so very quickly you run out of vulnerable, susceptible people to infect, and the thing stops. Unfortunately, the SAGE are unaware of this, or have deliberately kept themselves unaware of this. And so it's like immunity doesn't exist. And in relation to what we were just talking about, the day after the Great Barrington Declaration was launched, I heard a phrase I'd never heard before called "let it rip." And basically the criticism was, well, there are all these professors sitting around talking about, herd immunity, but in order to get there, given no one starts with immunity, you're going to have to let it rip through the population, and this will lead to hundreds of thousands of deaths. And I heard it on BBC, and then I heard it on Channel 4, and then ITV, and then in the Telegraph, and it was all day, every day for the next week on every single channel. And I'd never heard "let it rip." Well, I have where it comes to motor racing, but I'd never heard it in relation to disease. And so the conclusion I drew, without any special insight, is that the PsyOps group, Psychological Operations Group, thought, how can we make sure that people are aware that even to get to herd immunity is fraught with danger? That might be their honourable view. And even if it was, they would say, well, what we'll do is make sure people know that there's a really bad cost to this. We'll tell them that you have to let it rip through the population. So that was the example, and you gave the example, Rainer, of to try and make small children responsible for the deaths of their parents or grandparents. We have the same. Our university students were told, you can't go home for Christmas because you could kill your granny. You kill your grandmother. Yeah. They actually said, and so this is the phrase, well, we don't mean it seriously, but we call it "kill your granny." Yeah. And that phrase I've heard 100 times on the media since students went back to university. And it's just, I think it's a psychological operations tool. And it works, it works because most people don't understand immunity and disease transmission, and they know that their older relatives are vulnerable, and they know eventually they die, and they really, really don't want to be responsible for this. So they stay in their room. Anyway, so those are the three committees. I have one other, there may be others on this group may have given testimony I have missed. My daughter pointed this out. She is not a scientist, she's a social sciences graduate, and she then works in public relations in a charity. So she understands a little bit about messaging and how important certain messages can be. Now, the first time she heard this claim, she felt it was very important, and she's proven prescient. The phrase was asymptomatic transmission. So she's clever enough, and her father's always talking, as you will gather. And so she knew that it was kind of counterintuitive, because she even read this back to me. She said, well, Dad, if you if you are heavily infected with, you will have symptoms, right? And I said, yes. And if you don't have symptoms, you don't have much virus, yes. And you won't be coughing either, yes. So she said, well, how can it be possibly true that asymptomatic transmission occurs, or if it occurs, that it's anything other than a minor phenomenon? I said, well, you've hit the nail on the head. I don't care what science people come up with. We've known this as a human population for 60,000 years, that one way to avoid catching things from other people, one way to pick good mates and good associates is to look closely at them and decide whether you think they're well or not. And that's not perfect, but it's pretty good as a survival tool. And so we are very, very sensitive to the health status of other people, including people we've never met. We're extraordinarily good at it. So people will say, are you okay? They can tell you're not okay. And so the idea that asymptomatic transmission was common would make what I've just said impossible to work. It would not be possible to pick successfully, deselect people who are threatened to your health and to your family's health if asymptomatic transmission was so common as has been suggested this year. And so you know by inductive reasoning that it's not correct. And we also know by forward induction that, as my daughter said, you can't be, it's not easy to infect somebody unless you've got lots of virus, and then you need to be shedding the virus through respiratory maneuvers. Again, this is my area of skill, and I know this. So and yet we hear it all the time. We hear this asymptomatic transmission, and I'm going to go one or two steps further because I realize with mounting horror that I can't counter this, even with intelligent people I know. I describe how it's not true, not likely to be true. But having established in people's minds that asymptomatic transmission doesn't just occur, but is kind of really frequent, I mean, a serious, frequent thing, it justifies fear of other people, even when they look well. You can't tell. These people could be carrying lethal disease at any moment, and you could catch it and die. It also justifies mass screening of the population. You can't just test people who have symptoms, because look, all of these asymptomatic transmission people. So you have to test all the people, and then it gets worse. You have to test all the people all the time. And then here's the terrifying thing, forever. You need to test all the population all the time, forever, because of this asymptomatic transmission. So it's an innocent little phrase, and I could even have a good scientific debate with Professor Reupload of how many times this occurs. Probably there is some transmission just before overtly symptomatic, when the virus level is climbing quickly and you're not yet overtly ill. But for everybody else, if you've got too few virus, you don't have symptoms, you're not going to shed very easily. So I'm comfortable that asymptomatic transmission is not a major feature of epidemic spread. And therefore, I am fearful that it has been placed there in the public mind to justify mass screening all the time, forever, and that you can't trust anyone. And that, I think, has come from a combination of, I don't know, probably the psychological operations group, probably. So if you've heard this story before, that's very interesting, because I'm not aware of prior literature in this field. I mean specifically respiratory viruses. I'm well aware that you can have asymptomatic transmission of diseases that may take years before you would become ill. So you could carry a lethal virus that won't kill you for 20 years and you will look perfectly well. I do understand that asymptomatic transmission is absolutely possible. And we know that needle sharing in drug users can definitely lead to transmission of hepatitis, for example, and HIV, so it's said. So the public is familiar with the concept. They know it can occur. What they don't know is that in this specific setting, where the disease is in the lung, symptoms then come through respiratory symptoms, and then you shed virus, perhaps by coughing or releasing particles either into people's faces or on surfaces that they touch. And so now this is very different. It's not like transmission of hepatitis using a contaminated needle. It's completely different. And yet, having understood that this is a thing, this is what SAGE has told us, I speak to people all the time, intelligent people, and they go, oh, but what about asymptomatic transmission? How dare you even suggest, Mike, that you lower or temporarily pause PCR mass testing. So I proposed to people that there is a problem with PCR mass testing, and we can prove it with a brief pause, maybe for 2 or 3 weeks. And they go, yeah, but all the asymptomatic transmission will allow the virus, you let it rip. You see how it works.
Yeah.
It's so clever. And these are people I like, that know me. I know they're intelligent. They have a different skill set to me. And I can't persuade people I know and like, and they know I'm well-intentioned, and I can't persuade them. So you can just see, I almost feel despair, because some days I feel very positive. I feel very positive talking to you, because if we can successfully get people aware that there's something wrong with the mass testing, that's where we should go today, then that will have benefits in other countries, including my own. That's why I'm wanting to give as many hours as necessary. So that's the asymptomatic transmission. And then I'll just give one other example of some. First, it made me laugh and then frightened. So the modelling group, the first group of SAGE that I described, led by Professor Neil Ferguson, and it's full of mathematicians mostly. They're mostly mathematicians. I'm sure they're very good mathematicians and perfectly good individuals as human beings, but they're modelling a phenomena. Their biggest concern is usually what's called the R rate, how quickly the infection spreads from one person to another. And then they're also concerned with the non-pharmaceutical interventions. If we can prevent contacts between people, that will slow it down. I've never seen them concerned with how much prior immunity there was in the population, which seems rather important to me. And we now have, it seems to me, floating independently and completely outside of the awareness sphere of SAGE and of government, an enormous amount of literature on prior immunity, and even immunity in the present day. And you can literally hold the paper up in front of people and they go, yeah, but 510,000 deaths, mate. You know, it's so difficult. They believe what they've been told. And I say, well, you know, that's not true, because look, 50% of people have prior immunity. And they go, well, you don't know that that will work. And I go, well, I do actually. Look, here's what happened with SARS in 2003. So it's so difficult. And then I'm just going to now talk about something. So Professor Wooldarg may shoot me down at this point, but I hope not.
No.
So the math, well, I don't mind. You know, if I'm wrong, I want to be corrected. I have no reason to want to say anything other than the truth. So if I'm wrong, I want to be corrected so I can be right next time. So the mathematical modelers on the modelling group, they asserted that the lockdown in Britain, which started on March the 23rd, excuse me, there's traffic. Yes. So the modelling group said when not very many people died, by summer there were 40,000 people in Britain who had died within 28 days of having had a positive PCR test. So I'm resisting saying that they died because of the infection. Some of them probably did, but I'll just stick to the facts. 40,000 people had died within 28 days of a positive test by summer. And you'll remember that Imperial College told us that roughly 110,000 people should die. So I'm not joking. I had a conversation with email with one of these people, one of these modelers, and he more or less said, well, I'm not sure where all the missing dead people are. You know, it's literally, instead of saying, well, maybe my model is wrong, he wondered where the 470,000 dead people were. You know, why haven't they happened? I'm not kidding. He was so convinced his model was correct that he said to me, well, I'm fearful that 470 dead will, you know, they will appear if we don't do something. And so here's where they went. They said they assumed that the lockdown was so effective at preventing transmission that almost no one had been infected. So that 40,000 had come from infecting a tiny number of people. And so eventually they convinced the Prime Minister that basically the pandemic has not really started in Britain. They said only 7% of the population have been exposed, so 93% are still vulnerable. And remember, no one has immunity. So basically they were telling the Prime Minister in August that we're back in, it's like Groundhog Day. Groundhog, yeah, we go round and round. Because I would say most people would say 93% is roughly the same as 100%. They're very similar. And so they literally told the Prime Minister, their models say, we have this model, and it says we are the same threat as we were in February. And so, and you know how this was manifest, because people were saying, well, show me how you think people will die. And then we got a phrase that we've heard again and again, which is kind of bizarre because it doesn't happen. So they started talking about second wave. Now, forgive me, but if you have an unmitigated spread of a new virus through a population, it may spread very quickly. We think this one does spread very quickly. And so before we even got to lockdown, I think the virus has been in the country long enough for it probably have gone from one end to the other and back again. And so I think the idea that only 7% have been exposed seemed really surprising, very unusual, and completely counterintuitive, say, to every winter season of influenza. We know this doesn't take 9 months or 10 months to travel through the country. It takes maybe 2 or 3 or 4 months, and then it's done. So they said there's going to be a second wave, and they show you that you can go and find it online. It's a public document, and it looks just like the first wave, where time goes on and there's not much happening, and then you start to see a few deaths, and then it goes exponential, and it climbs and climbs and climbs, and then for some reason they don't seem to describe, they don't seem to understand why it turns. They really don't. It turns, and then gradually it falls again. And this time, their second wave was twice as big as the first one. I don't know how they got that. They literally, I've written to them politely as a fellow academic, as it were, and said, that's very interesting. So would you mind explaining to me why you predict the curve is twice as big in terms of numbers of death, when surely at worst there could be no change in immune status? And I argue many people are now, they didn't answer, of course. So basically, I hope it's just inexpert mathematicians trying their best to, as it were, create a model that accounts for what they have seen, and therefore they can provide appropriate warnings. You can see I'm trying desperately hard to say that it's not a conspiracy, because I have no evidence directly from them. I have no evidence directly that it's a conspiracy. Personally, all of my instincts are shouting conspiracy, okay, as a human being. But as a scientist, I can't point to the smoking gun that says that they've made this up on purpose. So what I can say is the group had no immunologists, didn't have anybody that could sense check what they were saying, just to check, does this make any sense? And they have produced, and this is now the current operating plan for UK, and it's why I'm here. It's why I'm in France, because the country is the Prime Minister and the ministers think the country is under severe threat of second wave, and so they've locked down harder, for longer. And the most frightening thing I've ever heard this year is they've made international outbound travel illegal, except for certain prescribed purposes. So as a private citizen, if I went home to visit my children or grandchildren, it would be illegal for me to leave my country to come back here to my property in France, a country that welcomes me. So I have not gone home. I've just decided this is very bad, that this has never happened even in wartime, and there's no reason for it. And I could be paranoid, or I could be being sensible. I've just decided I'm not going home until this absurd law is removed. It's an affront, and it's frightening. Mm-hmm. So there you go. That's probably the end of a description of SAGE as a modelling group with psychological operations, non-pharmaceutical interventions, that there's a small group of 7 people or 8 people that sit on all of the subcommittees. They also interact directly with the Prime Minister and with the public. So you can see that I'm not saying there is, but if you wanted to fix things in a particular way, it's very easy, because there are so few actors in the drama. And we'll talk shortly, I think, maybe long, but we will eventually get to PCR testing, and there's something very mysterious there that has happened that also brings it into the orbit of only one person, which is interesting. That was not true in the spring. So that's where we are. You might want to, maybe I should let you take 2 or 3 minutes, Rainer. I've gone on too long, and you could maybe summarize that last part of whatever it was. Yes, it was about second waves and asymptomatic transmission. Those are the 2 things I think I've said that you've not had a chance to translate.
Okay, before I start translating, many of our viewers are English language viewers, so
Okay.
this is perfect, but some of them they speak only German, of course here in Germany, but also in Switzerland and in Austria. So I'm going to translate this, but let me just start out saying one thing. What you're describing is completely 1,000% identical to what's been going on here in this country and in the United States and in Canada.
I would just comment then that that's amazing, because why would they be the same?
Yeah.
They're supposed to be independent groups thinking very hard about their own country situation. And I believe I've described to you maybe half a dozen things that are brand new and I've never heard before and that don't make any sense. So, yeah, okay.
So the only countries where it went differently is, of course, Sweden. Yes. But despite Sweden's almost going through this whole thing unscathed, I mean, few things happened, of course, but just like with every seasonal flu, there are, of course, serious cases of illness, and there are, of course, people who die, and we all regret this. So none of us is denying that there is something out there. We're just saying it's not what they claim it is. Okay, let me translate. Okay. Also, Mike Eden sagt, er hat sich gewundert über diese psychologischen Operationen. Er hat auf der einen Seite zwar nachvollziehen können, dass es wichtig ist, dass man die Bevölkerung in schwierigen, gefährlichen Situationen in Anführungsstrichen unter Kontrolle bringt und dass man dafür auch psychologische Tricks braucht. Aber das, was er hier gesehen hat, das hat alles getoppt, was er bisher jemals gesehen hat. Er macht sich große Sorgen darüber, hofft, dass das alles keine Verschwörungstheorie ist, sondern dass hier einfach aus Versehen Fehler gemacht wurden von denjenigen, die all das, was jetzt abgelaufen ist und immer noch läuft, zu verantworten haben. Er hat auf 3 Dinge hingewiesen. Das eine ist, er hat sich gewundert darüber, dass plötzlich ganz neue Begriffe und ganz neue Vorgehensweisen, die es vorher noch nie gegeben hat, von denen er vorher nie gehört hat, gepusht wurden. Eins war, wenn wir das ganze Virus hier durchlaufen lassen, seine Formulierung und die in den Medien war, let it rip, hat er vorher nie gehört. Wenn wir das durchlaufen lassen, dann werden Hunderttausende sterben. Wieder Neil Ferguson ganz vorne, der erzählt hat, hier 400.000 Tote. Und die hat es bis heute nicht gegeben. Er sagt, wenn ein zweiter Begriff, den er für sehr wichtig hält, sind diese asymptomatischen Infektionen, asymptomatic infections. Sehr, sehr umstritten, ob es das gibt. Es gibt es in anderen Bereichen, sagt er, da kennt man das. Vielleicht kann Dr. Wodak gleich noch was dazu sagen. Es gibt es in anderen Bereichen hier, was das Virus angeht, eher nicht. Und wenn, dann sind die asymptomatischen Infektionen so zu vernachlässigen, dass sie hier keine Rolle spielen. By the way, even the CDC agrees on this as far as the asymptomatic infections are concerned, because what's his name, Fauci, he said, this is absolutely negligible. It doesn't play a role here. Na, also das ist wichtig zu wissen, auch die CDC, also das amerikanische Gegenstück zum RKI, Fauci sagen, das spielt keine Rolle. Hier wird aber so getan, als sei jeder potenziell infiziert, auch derjenige, der überhaupt keine Symptome zeigt. Und dem Grunde nach ist das komplett 1000%ig falsch. Ich habe darüber mit Professor Hockertz hier gesprochen, der sagte, wir können uns auf folgende Argumentation einigen. Asymptomatische Infektionen sind hoch umstritten. Erstens und zweitens ist kein einziger Fall nachgewiesen, wo eine asymptomatische Infektion existiert hat. Im Gegenteil, in dem Papier, es gibt 2 Papiere von Professor Drosten, eins ist vom 23. Januar, das ist das Papier, was gesagt hat, mit den PCR-Tests können wir genau feststellen, wer und wie viele Leute infiziert ist. Das ist das Papier, wir haben mit Professor Kemmerer darüber gesprochen, wissenschaftlich schlecht ist, dennoch von der WHO gepusht wurde. Danach wurden dann die Drosten-Tests weltweit kopiert und seither glaubt die halbe Welt oder auch die ganze Welt, dass man damit mit den PCR-Tests Infektionen feststellen kann. Aber das zweite Papier befasst sich mit den asymptomatischen Infektionen. Das ist ein Papier, das als Preprint am 30. Januar rauskam und da wird davon gesprochen, und Und das ist ja erforderlich, um die Panik zu verbreiten. Man muss vor jedem Angst haben. Da wird davon gesprochen, dass es eine Chinesin aus Wuhan gegeben habe, die nach Frankfurt eingereist ist und dann weiter, glaube ich, nach Bayern zu Webasto, keinerlei Symptome gehabt habe und da eine Menge Leute infiziert habe. Als dieses Preprint bekannt wurde, hat sich ein Wissenschaftsjournalist, glaube ich, namens Kai Kupferschmidt gemeldet und gesagt, das stimmt nicht. Die Frau hatte Infektionen, denn sie hat Paracetamol, also ein Schmerzmittel eingenommen, was man gegen Grippesymptome nimmt. Also niemand schmeißt sich das ein, weil es so toll schmeckt, sondern die hatte Infektion.
Wahrscheinlich sogar relativ schwere Krankheitssymptome. Wer Paracetamol nimmt, der ist in der Regel krank.
Ja. Und trotzdem, obwohl Drosten das wusste, hat er dieses Preprint kurze Zeit später ohne jede Abänderung veröffentlicht. Let me just interject in order to explain to you what I just said, because as far as these asymptomatic infections are concerned, the now infamous Professor Drosten, who there's a lot of, we all worry about his academic credentials, but that's a side story that will come into play when it comes to his credibility in court. But what he did is he published two papers. One is the paper that was published on January 23rd, which claims that he had invented a new PCR test which would be capable of detecting infections. That was pushed through his friends at the WHO, and everybody in the entire world is now or started using the Drosten test, and everybody who then entered the field, he was a so-called first mover. He and his cronies made probably a lot of money, but everybody else who entered the field followed his blueprint, and they all copied these same PCR tests. But I'm also saying there is another paper which he published as a preprint on January the 30th, and in this paper he claims that there are asymptomatic infections, because you need this in order to spread as much panic as possible by making everybody afraid of everybody. And he hinted, and he gave an example of this woman who traveled into our country through the Frankfurt airport from Wuhan, and then went on to I think a car manufacturer supplier in Bavaria, infected a lot of people there, and he claims she had no symptoms. So that was his example, his scientific example of how there are asymptomatic infections. However, a journalist who had read his paper found out that this woman was taking anti-flu medication, and pretty strong anti-flu medication, as my friend and colleague Dr. Hoffman just pointed out to me, meaning she must have had symptoms, because you don't eat this stuff because it tastes so great. And nevertheless, he published the paper without pointing out that he had made a mistake there.
Even though I'd like to add, even though that he even personally later had admitted that he had never had any contact with that woman.
Yeah.
They did not examine her or even talk to her.
And that's why we, in the meantime, believe that this is no coincidence, but it's intent. But I'll get to that later. I'll finish translating this. Hat dann weiter gesagt, dass er große Schwierigkeiten hat, auch mit Leuten, zu denen er sehr engen Kontakt hat, von denen er wissenschaftlich und auch persönlich sehr viel hält, sehr intelligente Leute, die davon zu überzeugen, dass das hier anders ist, weil in dem Moment, wo er das sagt, kommt immer die Antwort, ja, aber da sind so viele tot, das sind so viele tot. Das, sagt er, hat aber mit den Infektionen nichts zu tun. Die Infizierten oder die sogenannten Positiven hätten mit den vielen Toten nichts zu tun, da werden wir gleich noch drauf kommen. Dann hat er noch erklärt, dass diese Modeling Group, also diese 3 Gruppen, die es innerhalb von SAGE gibt, dass diese Modeling Group schwerwiegende Fehler macht, indem sie davon ausgeht, dass es keine frühere Immunity gegeben hat, keine Prior Immunity, keine Grundimmunität sozusagen, und deswegen nur mit diesem Lockdown gearbeitet werden kann. Trotzdem hat diese Modeling Group diese eigene Argumentation nur noch schwer aufrechterhalten können, weil es sind eben nicht diese 400.000 oder sonst wie Toten gekommen, sondern es gab dann nur diese rund 40.000 Toten, die die Grundlage für den Lockdown waren. Und die irre Argumentation die hier genauso gekommen ist, war dann in England, ja, das ist, weil der Lockdown die anderen verhindert hat. In the meantime, we know, by the way, that here in Germany, when the lockdown was announced, the wave of whatever, of the coronavirus, had already been receding for I think 2 or 3 weeks or so. So this argument...
Same in the UK.
That's definitely what I thought. See, that argument does not fly. Und dann sagt er, das nächste Ding, was er überhaupt nicht mehr verstehen kann, ist dann die Geschichte von der Second Wave, also eine zweite Welle. Sowas geht nicht bei dem, über das wir hier sprechen, sagt er, sondern das Virus wird normalerweise nach 3 bis 4 Monaten spätestens wieder weg sein und dann fängt eben was Neues an im Herbst, so wie es jetzt auch gerade ist. Er hat das versucht, den Leuten in dieser Gruppe und in der Regierung beizubringen. Die sind aber in keiner Weise darauf eingegangen. Jetzt, sagt er, ist es in England noch eine Nummer schwieriger geworden, weil jetzt gibt es, was den International Travel angeht, gibt es eine Restriction. Er darf, wenn er in das Land zurückfliegt, seine Kinder, seine Enkelkinder besuchen will, dann kommt er nur noch aus wichtigem Grund wieder raus. Deswegen sagt er, bleibt er jetzt erstmal da. Ein weiterer großer Punkt, auf den wir sicherlich gleich kommen, sagt er, sind natürlich die PCR-Tests. Also we have the panic mongering. Let me just, before I end with my translation, the panic mongering is based on 2 basically false statements. One is there are asymptomatic infections, and even if there are, even the CDC says this is completely inconsequential. It's negligible. It doesn't make a difference. And the other basic false statement, which is probably even worse, or on the same level, is you can detect infections by way of using PCR tests. I just explained to our viewers that in the meantime, the situation has gotten worse in Great Britain insofar as now international outbound travel is restricted, and that's why you chose not to go back and see your children and grandchildren, but for the time being, you're staying in France. Okay.
That's correct. Yes, it's not just restricted. You can apparently outbound international travel from the UK is permitted for, I think, for business purposes. There might be other reasons, but business purposes. But other than that, it's illegal. They've actually changed the law. It's not. So basically, if I tried to, normally I would say if I were to buy myself an inflatable boat with a little engine on the back and go for a little sail around off the coast near where I live, people might say I was reckless. But they wouldn't say it was illegal. But if I were to do that now and put a little knapsack of possessions on and head off to France, that would be an illegal act. And that's just frightening. Why would you make something like this illegal? You just should say, well, it's inadvisable. Also, why would you ban outbound travel? How does that in any way how can that reduce the spread of an infectious disease? Of course, the answer might be for the country you're going to, but France doesn't have any inbound restrictions, at least not from the UK. They do require, interestingly, that you have a negative PCR test within 72 hours or less. And if you don't have that, you will be required to submit yourself to one of those tests. I happened to pick up a new hire car yesterday from Nice Airport, which is spooky.
Let me clarify this because it's important. It's not just restrictions, it's illegal. Also sagt, es ist ihm ganz wichtig, dass jeder versteht, dass es nicht nur einfach Restriktionen, Reisebeschränkungen gibt, das Land zu verlassen, sondern dass es illegal, das heißt also strafbar geworden ist, das Land zu verlassen. Und er kann nicht verstehen, was die Ursache dafür sein kann, weil wenn man das Land selber schützen will, macht es ja keinen Unterschied, ob Leute das Land verlassen. Im Übrigen gibt es keine Restriktionen für die Einreise nach Frankreich, außer dass inzwischen, glaube ich, verlangt wird, wenn ich es richtig verstanden habe, dass man innerhalb von 78 Stunden einen Negativtest beschafft. You know, the same thing happened when the Berlin Wall came up. They kept their own people inside the country, and nobody quite understood what this was all about.
Yes. Okay. So, and I found it disquieting, to say the least. And Yes, I think it would be fair to say, because I'm probably one of the more noisy critics of the policy. I'm not a campaigner. I have never been allied to any political group in my life, and I'm not now. I'm not a member of a political group. My political involvement has been restricted to voting about every 4 years. That's all I've ever done. I've never written political pieces of paper, anything, ever. I'm just a professional scientist, and because I have now some time, I was paying attention. And because I'm very troubled, I am writing as a concerned citizen who happens to have expertise in certain areas. And so I've become a very strong, vocal, and I think plausible, very believable critic. So I've not received any threats of any kind. I don't feel I'm under any threat. But the truth is, now I'm seeing the government doing things that frighten me. Lots of people have said this, I'm genuinely more frightened by government than of the virus. And now they've made it illegal if I come home to leave. Now how safe am I feeling? Stuck in my own country, being one of the most vocal critics, that doesn't feel a very sensible thing to do. So I just decided, well, I like Nice. I'm going to stay here. Why wouldn't I stay here? I can't come back. So I might as well just stay here. We have there's Zoom calls, and I speak to my children and grandchildren every day. That's all we can do. And of course, if this is all benign, if this is all natural, it will soon pass, right? Like every other infectious disease. So if it doesn't pass quickly, then maybe I'm right to be concerned, and I'd rather be here. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I notice we've been joined by Dr. Claire Craig, and maybe I could just take one moment just to describe so that Dr. Craig, I work with Dr. Craig, and I like him very much. He's a very clever person, spots things I miss, and I hope vice versa. So Claire, so far, after an hour, I've just, I think, adequately described SAGE and its subcommittees and some of the happenings from subcommittees, like the non-pharmaceutical interventions, some of the key phrases like let it rip and kill a granny. There's all sorts of PsyOps stuff. And I've talked about the modelling. I've talked about this sort of unaccountable second wave phenomenon to try and explain where the missing 470,000 deaths that haven't occurred, where are they? And so they've come up with a model that could capture them, as it were. I'm making the assumption they are honourable. At least some of the people doing the modelling are genuine mathematicians trying to work this out. And then yes, so the modelling we think has gone a bit wrong. The psychological operations are designed to scare the population, and they do have a legitimate purpose in a genuine emergency. Is to, frankly, make people do what's good for them. So I understand the reason it exists in the emergency planning group. And then the non-pharmaceutical intervention group likewise exists because with a new threat, you have to do what you can do. So they've come up with things like lockdown, masks, social distancing, and so on. But I think even if this starts an attempt to counter a new virus, it's become itself a pathology. I think that's not even a particularly radical step. So that's as far as and then we talked a bit, Claire, about asymptomatic transmission and how that justifies mass screening all the time, forever, because otherwise how are you going to find these people who are a threat to you? So I think that's about as far as we got. And if the committee wanted to, and we were to turn to PCR, what we could do is do this together, because I probably have certain things I would want to say, and I know you've got additional observations that you've told me about that I would inadequately describe. And so you're not late, you haven't missed anything. In fact, you've timed it perfectly.
Thank you very much for having me. Can I just make one little observation about the massive thing? I've tried, and I can't say that I've succeeded because that's the nature of scientific literature, but I tried to look at all the studies that reported asymptomatic spread. And when I found the original papers, there were two types of paper. There were the papers that said asymptomatic spread was a serious thing. There were these super spreaders and it was a dangerous thing we had to sort out. And there were papers that said, well, we couldn't find that. We found the opposite. And the papers that said that it was a big deal, they were all Chinese publications.
Interesting. Okay.
So in essence, there's thus far, I spoke with one of the German immunologists, I think he is one, Professor Hockertz, and he explained to me that there's no scientific evidence thus far. There's never been scientific evidence. It's a matter of a very hot debate whether asymptomatic infections exist or not, but he says thus far no evidence for it has ever been found. And I explained about the assertion of Professor Drosten, who started all this from here in Germany with the help of the WHO, that he mentioned one example, and it turns out that the example that he mentioned of a woman traveling from China, from Wuhan through Frankfurt to Bavaria to a automobile supplier, and infecting a lot of people without showing any symptoms is wrong, because a journalist found out that this woman was taking anti-flu medication, pretty strong anti-flu medication. So even that example, which he was trying to make in order to show that everybody should be afraid of everyone, is wrong. And you haven't found any such evidence either, if I got you correctly, right?
Well, that's right. So there are cases in the literature that there are a few of these papers that were published in China, but I don't think were necessarily even aimed at us. I think it might have been internal Chinese propaganda, but they're taken up by Western scientists and put into meta-analyses, and then you get an average of the two sets. The raw data was there were this binary grouping in the raw data.
Also sie sagt es auch, sie hat keinen derartigen Nachweis für asymptomatische Infektionen gefunden. Es gibt darüber chinesische Artikel, die teilweise im Westen übernommen wurden, aber there's nothing it's not possible to check on whether what they're saying in these articles is correct or not.
What, the Chinese ones?
Yeah.
They look like proper scientific articles with a team, and they look all right.
Okay, also es sieht aus, als wären sie sagt, die sehen aus wie wissenschaftliche Artikel, aber sie hat da offenbar ihre Zweifel. Okay, go ahead.
I have one question before we move over to the PCR test with regards to the SAGE. Is there a timeline that you could see? When did they start with the minutes that you were able to see? Dr. Jeden, at what time did they come out? Because from when is our panic paper?
The panic, I think, was in May of this year.
I think it was in May, but yours was, I just had the idea that we're looking for the spider and the web. Where does all this origin from? Right. In case there's...
Claire, you might remember as well, but basically there is a businessman, Mr. Simon Dolan, D-O-L-A-N, Dolan. And basically, he was bringing a judicial review against whether the government's lockdown was an appropriate thing to do. I don't remember the legal details. But as part of this exchange with the government, the judge, I guess, ruled that SAGE minutes, the minutes of this committee, must be published. Otherwise, how can we examine whether what they were doing was reasonable? And I think, Claire, that was released in early second half, maybe June, July, something like that.
Okay, but when were these minutes taken? Do you remember that?
I think they started in February. I think. I could, if it's very important to get the dates right, then can we just park, as we would say? Can we park this, and I can find that out for you and let Rainer know.
Yeah, is it really important?
Well, I think it's important for an investigation.
The date isn't so important, I don't think. But the date isn't so important. It's the content of the minutes, right?
But it's also
if I can get a link to all the minutes, I can just let you have that, and you can go and read.
Yeah.
If I can't find them, I know people. So I will say a link to all the SAGE minutes. I think, interestingly, after they were forced to reveal the minutes, I think they either stopped having meetings, or probably they did something very typical British civil service, that if you've been ordered to release the minutes of the meetings called SAGE, what you do is change the name of the meeting, call it SGEA or something. Then of course, you no longer have to release the minutes. I'm not kidding. It's as simple as that. You look at the instruction. You don't look at the spirit of the instruction. You look at the order, and it says whatever. And I think basically the same group of people continue to meet about the same topics, but they no longer release the minutes.
Well, if you take all this together, we are not talking about 1,000 different accidents.
No.
This makes this is a pattern, and it shows exactly what's going on. To me, as a lawyer, it makes perfect sense. But let me just quickly explain this. Also, diese Protokolle, die du haben willst, was Mike Eden sagt, es gibt ja sowas Ähnliches wie unser Panikpapier. Und das ist rausgekommen, weil ein Businessman namens Dolan die Regierung verklagt hat und gesagt hat, die hätte ich jetzt gerne. Und dann kam der Inhalt raus, aber die sind offenbar nicht veröffentlicht worden, obwohl ein Gericht gesagt hat, es muss veröffentlicht werden.
Doch, die sind dann veröffentlicht.
Ach, sind sie doch veröffentlicht worden, weil die Gefahr bestand, dass es nicht passiert, weil typischerweise machen dann in England die Leute, wenn sie aufgefordert werden, ein Teil der Regierung aufgefordert wird, ihr müsst das veröffentlichen, dann ändern sie einfach den Namen, sodass sie sagen, ja, das sagen wir nicht mehr. Ja.
Das ist im Nachgang zu der Gerichtsentscheidung passiert, aber er meinte, dass er uns einen Link zur Verfügung stellen kann, wo wir eben die echte Gesprächsprotokolle quasi, also auch nochmal anders unter Umständen als das, was wir als dieses Endresultat haben.
Why we're so interested in this is because everything is completely identical thus far. From what you're telling us, what happened there and what happened here in Germany, and from what happened in the United States, and this is secondhand knowledge because from my friends in Canada, I've been told that the very same thing was happening there. And that's why Viviane is so very interested in the actual content of these minutes, because if it shows that they're almost identical, then the pattern becomes ever clearer. Okay. And
then, it would be interesting to see if our government, if they following the same line of reasoning, then it would need to be that they can provide information that maybe they receive from the British government or something like that, so because you don't do this out of the blue, that you find the same wordings. We have exactly the same, the second wave, the asymptomatic, the super spreader. And I think
that's interesting.
It's not just a media thing.
A very good point. So, sorry to interrupt you, but just to build on your point. So, Claire, I have said persistently that regardless of my personal views, so instinctively as a citizen, to be very worried about what's happening and so on, as a scientist, I try to just remain on the science and say, well, there is no evidence for this to be happening, or there's no literature behind what you're saying here. So I try and stay on the science and not imply people have bad motives or to imply an individual is doing something wrong. Now, I understand as a lawyer, you might want to do quite the opposite and say, well,
no, we have to start. We have to start out the very same way. We have to first get the facts right, and only if you have the correct facts can you draw the right legal conclusions from that.
I agree. I absolutely agree. But I just want Claire to know that it's not. Well, we both believe it's simply not necessary for us as scientists to suggest anyone has bad motives in order to point out that there are some serious problems with testing and diagnosis and then other things that are being said, like a second wave, which I don't think there's a second wave at all.
I totally agree. And I think the coincidental timing of things simply be that in May, everybody went and got antibody data. So they went to do these tests to see who was still susceptible. They totally misinterpreted it, but they then had this belief that there was a lot of susceptibility still, and that in the same way everywhere at the same time.
Yeah.
And likewise, whole genome sequencing is being done globally, and the interpretations of that are not being questioned globally.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are more and more people coming out and asking questions, but thus far, the panic mode has more or less stifled everything. One other thing that I wanted to get clear before we continue, Mike and Claire, the two errors that you point to in your latest piece, What Sage Has Got Wrong, is error number one, assuming that of the two errors of Sage. Error number 1, assuming that 100% of the population was susceptible to the virus and that no pre-existing immunity existed. And error number 2, the belief that the percentage of the population that has been infected can be determined by surveying what fraction of the population has antibodies. And you drew, there's a graphic in that paper. Can you quickly explain this? Because we're gonna get a link to this paper and to the graphic, I think, on our website as well, because this is really easy to understand, I think. It
is exactly. So again, I credit my non-scientific clever daughter, because I was describing it and she said, but it's too complicated. But she drew a pie chart and she said, well, you don't need, so on the left side, you will see a circle representing all of the people in the country, 100% of the people. It's just an open circle. And she said, well, SAGE has not referred to anyone having prior immunity, even though, and I'll just give this example because everybody knows it from school, that if you've been infected in the old days with cowpox, you're not susceptible to catching smallpox, which was a very, very serious and lethal disease. And we knew this from an experiment conducted by Mr. Edward Jenner. And that's sort of the heart of vaccination. And it also proves this notion of cross immunity. If you're immune to something, your body may be, depends on how similar it is, but you may be also immune to something that's related. So this is a really, really well understood phenomenon before we even understood immunology. So I've lost the thread of my thinking. Yes, so despite that, SAGE, who lacked cellular immunologists or clinical immunologists, so maybe this was the reason, but despite this idea that if you've been exposed to something similar, you may have some immunity to this, quote, new thing. Despite that being well established, SAGE ascribed the number of people with prior immunity 0, and it just 0. And so, in other words, 100% of the people were susceptible. Now, I understand the precautionary principle argument that, well, we don't want to make a particular guess because if we're wrong, whatever. But you must understand the effect of assuming no one was immune is everyone is susceptible and the disease will keep burning through the population until, quote, herd immunity is reached, which is, it's not simple. It's the percentages that have to be not susceptible for a disease to no longer spread in an accelerating fashion. It's not simple. It depends on a number of things. But in this case, it is assumed to be about 60% or 65%. Sorry, the number susceptible has to be 40% or less. Mm-hmm. And then at that point, most people would say, yes, it will no longer accelerate and will gradually die out. And if you ascribe 0 to the value of prior immunity, that means all of the 60% required to become immune have to be infected before you reach this happy day where the infection stops spreading. They were able to that because of the lethality of this virus, the high lethality, can't possibly be serious, Doctor, even allow the infection to spread through this population of 60% of people when there's such high lethality. We'll literally have corpses piled up on the pavements. But so you can see it may just be an accidental coincidence of them not having the right expertise, but the outcome was everyone is susceptible. It's a very lethal virus. Consequently, you could not allow the normal natural process of herd immunity to be arrived at because you'd end up with, wartime amounts of dead. But for a start, I don't think it was ever reasonable to say no one had immunity, even if you didn't know the number. Seriously, if you didn't know the number, you would look at the new virus and you would say, well, it's a coronavirus. Well, we've known about those, I think, since 1965 when I was very small. And we've learned a lot about them since. We know that some can infect animals, some humans, and maybe some have crossed over. But the important fact is we know that at least 4 of them, and just to show off, I'll name some of them: HKU1, E229, OC43, and one other. So I'm not trying to show off, but just saying they're well understood. You can easily find them by Googling. And there are 4 common cold-causing coronaviruses that kill very few people, if anybody, and they circulate and they come up and down seasonally in the population everywhere I've looked, certainly in the UK. And I think then if you look at the sequences, the RNA sequences, you don't find complete identity anywhere with SARS-CoV-2, but what you do find is some areas where similarity is quite high. High enough, in my view, to expect some people who've been exposed to those common cold-causing coronaviruses to have some immunity, some cross-immunity. And I guessed this in March. And I didn't write it as a paper because it was just literally a guess based on being a scientist rather than a sequence-based immunologist. And so I was very pleased when Professor Drosten in mid-April published the first of many papers now showing exactly this, that T cells from people who had not yet been exposed to the virus were capable of responding in vitro to the virus. And I think his number was maybe 40%, something like that. And through the rest of the spring, at least 6 really important papers were published from top quality cellular immunological groups, published in the best peer-reviewed journal articles in the world, like Science and Nature, and they were from Karolinska Institute, I think, and places in Germany and others. And so I believe that certainly by the end of April and certainly by June, I would say if you spoke to someone who understood the immunology, they would say it's absolutely certain that somewhere between 30% and maybe 50% have prior immunity. And if you ask them, do they think it would be functionally relevant? When some of them would just look at you astonished and say, well, what do you mean? I'd say, well, do you think that property of your T cells responding to the virus, even though they've not yet, the body has not experienced the virus, is that functionally important? They would go, some of them said to me, Mike, that's how immunity works. And others would try to deal more seriously with the question and say, well, yes, I've looked at the T cell responses of the same people to things they were vaccinated against maybe 20 years ago. I could try and do the control experiments and say, I stick some of their T cells to a plastic plate and then I apply what's called an epitope, a piece of the thing that they were made immune to. And then I could look at how vigorously their T cells respond in terms of proliferation. And then do the same experiment with SARS-CoV-2 and these interestingly responding T cells, and they said they look very similar.
So
they said, yeah.
Just one thing. I think you said you meant not Professor Drosten, but Professor Wodak, because you're saying that in March.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Because you were pleased to read something from a serious scientist, and not.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I'm sorry, Professor Wodak. If yours was the first group to do it, I suddenly burst into a very happy round of applause. And second, I remember somebody asked me this question. They said, how did they manage to do this so quickly? And I said, I don't think they did do it that quickly. I said, my guess, and I'd love to meet them, is they were thinking about this much earlier than, I said, my guess is they were probably thinking about this in January, because the amount of time it takes to go through ethics, to design the experiment, to find the people, to get the samples, these are difficult experiments technically. I haven't done these, but I've done the same with B cells, looking at ELISpot B cells and so on. Mm-hmm. So I know how difficult they are. If you've got a really experienced lab, you definitely can do it, but these are not 5 minutes or 5 days. Mm-hmm. So I think the amount of time to plan it, to execute it, and then to write it up and get it in a journal. They must have been thinking about it earlier than March, I think. So, yes.
I totally agree, Mike, and I think that's all praise to them.
Yeah.
I'd like to say that when I first started researching all of this, which was the beginning of September, I was researching the PCR stuff, and I had this problem in my mind that I thought the PCR tests were producing false results, but I still thought we had a susceptible population. Mm-hmm. So I thought that based on the antibody testing. So as well as knowing that, 7% had it in the population as a whole, there were higher rates in London. There were higher rates still in the staff in the hospitals in London and in the kind of Ischgl Austrian ski resort. And there was of 90%-ish rate in people who we knew had it. And that concerned me hugely. I was really genuinely concerned we had a susceptible population. And it's only by digging through all that data and spending some time on it and looking at it as a diagnostic pathologist, so questioning what they were measuring, that I've come to realize that it's all a measurement problem. But to say that everyone else should have realized that is quite a leap.
Let me quickly translate again, so that we won't lose track. Die beiden großen Fehler, von denen Mike Jeden spricht, die von SAGE, also von dieser Notfallberatungstruppe begangen wurden, war der erste Fehler, und über den haben wir jetzt die ganze Zeit gesprochen, dass die davon ausgegangen sind, dass die Gesamtbevölkerung durch das Virus gefährdet ist und dass es überhaupt keine Grundimmunität gibt. Und dazu hat er durch die Hilfe seiner Tochter diese Grafik gemacht. Das werden wir nochmal öffentlich machen, indem wir das verlinken werden. Also nicht nur die Grafik, sondern das ganze Paper. Das ist einfach ein super Teil. Das kann man sehr, sehr gut verstehen. Ich erläutere das mal kurz. Die SAGE-Gruppe sagt, 93%, also fast 100% der Bevölkerung sei gefährdet, weil es keine Grundimmunität, keine Hintergrundimmunität gibt. 7% seien infiziert und 93% seien also gefährdet. Die Realität sieht anders aus. Es gibt nämlich eine 30%ige vorige Immunität, und Mike Jeden weist darauf hin, dass der Körper, dass das Immunsystem des Körpers, wenn es irgendwann mal irgendeinen dieser anderen Coronaviren getroffen und besiegt hat, bekämpft hat, dass es sich das merkt, und wenn dann ein angeblich neues Virus auftaucht, 4 gibt es, die sind sowieso endemic, also die sind lange schon in der Bevölkerung. Wenn dann ein angeblich neuer Strain auftaucht, dann erkennt es das, auch wenn es nicht ganz dasselbe ist. Das nennt sich dann T-Zellenimmunität. Ich will aber nicht zu viel Medizinisches erzählen, damit ich mich nicht verheddere. Jedenfalls, es gibt tatsächlich eine Grundimmunität in Höhe von 30%. Inzwischen sind 32% infiziert und nicht nur 7, wie damals der Beratungsausschuss gesagt hat. Wir haben also über 60%, die gar nicht mehr in diese Risikogruppe fallen. Und dann kann man die Kinder noch abziehen, hat er gesagt, 10% von Kindern, die so gut wie keine Rolle spielen bei den Infektionen und bei der Weitergabe. Das heißt, in Wahrheit sind nicht knapp 100% oder 93% gefährdet, sondern nur 28% sind susceptible. So that was one of the two major mistakes that they made. Yeah. I actually don't believe that's an innocent mistake, but anyway. And the second one is the belief that the percentage of the population that has been infected can be determined by surveying what fraction of the population has antibodies.
Yes, so let me just expand, please, on that one.
Yeah.
So because it depends on how you do the survey, it might be a very reasonable thing. So I am aware of scientific studies, I think in Japan and possibly other countries, where a group of individuals was followed every day through a coronavirus outbreak. And I think if not every day, then very often they were tested to see if they had the virus by PCR. And also very frequently, if not every day, they were tested using what I would describe as a high sensitivity antibody test. And they were really trying to see if there's any at all. And when they did that, they found very close relationship between becoming infected and the appearance of antibodies. And that's not unsurprising. It's not, yes, it's to be expected that the body processes this infected threat. And if it's a new threat, it may take 2 weeks to produce antibodies. But if you've seen it before, you can certainly produce antibodies much more quickly in a few days. Actually, Claire, I don't remember whether I've gone back through that paper, but I'll get back to my theme in a moment. But what I've just described, that is not what was happening when England was surveying its population in May. They were using antibody, so they were very careful. Again, I take a step back. When you design a new test system, you more or less are forced to choose between two things that are important to you. You have to decide which one is most important right now. You can choose either very high sensitivity, so turn up the amplification to make sure you don't miss any of the thing you're trying to measure, or you can choose very high cell activity so that the test only responds to the thing you're interested in and not to anything else. And I'm afraid they're always in conflict. Sometimes you can get a good outcome on both of them, but they are in conflict. If you wind up the amplification, you're more likely, are you not, to get some signal from things that are not what you're trying to measure. And so it's very hard to have a very, very, very sensitive assay that is at the same time very, very, very selective. And so early in the evolution of a new disease, I've done this myself. I've designed what's called an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. They're called ELISA. And it's an easy way of testing whether or not there is some binding material in the blood sample or in the serum sample. And early on, you probably have not got optimum tools. And so you end up designing an assay that's capable of detecting antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, not going to cross-react with anything else. So if you get a signal, you believe it's true. But it's not a very sensitive test. And so what happens is you miss people who've got smaller amounts of antibody. That's what happens. And then if you were infected, say, a month ago, and you had almost no symptoms, like the WHO said, is for most people, you don't get severe disease. Some people don't get any symptoms at all. I'm sure that's true. And the body is very parsimonious. It's very efficient with its resources. And if the body can cope with an infection without using the full armamentarium of immunological techniques, then it will do so. So if it can kill the virus just using what's called innate immunity, just uses a way of detecting it's been invaded and killing those cells, that would be a very efficient way of doing it. Well, those people are not going to have antibodies in their blood. Never. Why would they? They killed the virus in a few hours or a couple of days. They never invoked the cellular system, and they were perfectly healthy and well. But if you went and measured the antibodies in these people from this encounter, there wouldn't be any, because they didn't need to do that. So I knew straight away that a big fraction of people, I was told, had infection without symptoms, and I knew a big fraction of those would have dealt with this virus easily, and would have done so using what's called the innate immune system. And so they would not seroconvert. They would not have antibodies. So I think, and then here's the other thing, that even if you had made some antibodies, if you're not exposed to the virus again, your body is very efficient. If you were not exposed to the virus again, after a while, your body would realize it doesn't need to keep making these expensive antibodies, keeping them up in the blood. And so if it wasn't being re-stimulated, what happens is the antibody production winds down. And so over time, the prediction would be in a population not exposed anymore to a virus, you would expect the population levels of antibodies to fall, either the percentage of people with antibodies or the average amount of antibody in the blood in each person. And so if in May they went around and did a survey, which they did in London and other places, I would predict the people who never made antibodies will be negative, but they've been infected and we don't know who they are. People who had a small amount of antibody, because it was a little bit more difficult for them to fight off the virus, but not difficult, they might have made a little antibody, that would have probably faded away if they were not re-exposed to the virus. And as I'll explain shortly, they won't. So I was confident that 7%, which is the percentage they said had antibodies at the end of May, I think it was, middle or end of May, I felt the only sure thing you could say about it is it's an underestimate of the number who'd been exposed. And there was lots of literature at the time where they had examined people who had been very ill with coronavirus and they'd been in intensive care. And pretty much all of these people had antibodies and lots of it, and that's not surprising. There are lots of immune mechanisms to defend you against infectious attack. And you would use all of those up and maybe also produced antibodies up. Whether that was protective or not is a separate question. But so the people who'd been very ill in intensive care, if you got hold of some of their blood in hospital or over the weeks to follow, you could find lots and lots of antibodies. But they then went to find people who'd had mild symptoms. So they had PCR positive and they had some mild symptoms that were consistent with SARS. SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, and they've measured their antibodies and they were less. A smaller percentage had antibodies and they had less antibodies. And then they went to find people who'd had, I think there were some people who have no symptoms and they had less antibodies still. So there's lots of literature. It wasn't just my Eden guessing that 7% would be an underestimate. I could go to the literature. In fact, Rainer, I cite the papers in that discussion where I say, Sage says 7% has been infected by means of this antibody test. And I've said, I think that's an underestimate by a difficult to estimate amount. And here are the 4 or 5 papers that I referred to. So they're in there. They're not just my opinion. And there are definitely people who have been infected who had antibodies that were too small to measure. And so basically their 7% assessment as to the population being infected, I thought was could potentially be a massive underestimate, potentially by 3 or 4-fold. I mean, that's a big deal. Well, if it's 7% being infected, then you've hardly started, and you're going to have a lot of deaths before you reach herd immunity. But if I'm right, and the underestimate is a severe underestimate, and maybe it's 3 times or 4 times or 5 times, then maybe it's 21 or 28 or 35%. So the latter position is we're nearly there. And in fact, that's my view, that they underestimated by between 3-fold and 5-fold, somewhere in there. And when you add on to that the number of people who were immune from Professor Rodard's work and other people's work through the year, the variable estimate of prior immunity, the lowest I ever saw was 20%, the highest ever was 80%, and that's on T cells. And I would say they clustered around 30 to 40%. So if you add the 30 to 40% to my estimate of how much Sage was wrong about the percentages that have been infected, I would have predicted around May or June that herd immunity has been reached. And we actually now know that was probably correct. And we should talk about that later. So you can see that I think Sage was horribly wrong by excluding any assignment of percentage of prior immunity. They've never changed their estimate, by the way, even though there are now at least 10 papers on this front in Science and Nature. These are proper papers. And as far as I know, they've never modified their model. For the second wave, they've not modified the model and said, the data now says 60%, say 50% are immune, and therefore only a small number could be infected before herd immunity is reached. So that was, people pressed me and they said, second wave, could there be any possibility of some more deaths? And I said yes, that if it's true that in winter transmission is increased, and I do believe that's possible, not an expert in the infectious disease, but I looked at the literature and I thought, oh my God, yes, that's certainly true. Then if most people by this point, if a lot of people were immune because they had prior immunity or because they had been infected, survived and become immune, then if now the transmission is greater, what that does is it requires what's got a higher herd immunity threshold. Basically, because the infection can more easily spread in winter, it would be arguable that we need a few more percent, a higher percentage to be immune before the infection stops. But when I did the maths on the back of a piece of paper, I realized, well, that cannot be many people, a small percentage of the population, maybe 5 or 10%. And if you spread that out over a period of days or weeks, and then you work out what fraction could actually become ill and die, my guess was you wouldn't actually notice. You wouldn't notice. There would just be a small number of excess deaths over a period of a few weeks in winter, and it would be hidden under the normal annual deaths from cold weather, from influenza, and so on. So I hope it wasn't meant to be trite, but I gave this phase, I gave it a name, and I called it the secondary ripple. And I think I invented the phrase for Twitter. I put #secondary ripple, because people were attacking me when I said, viruses don't do waves. Honestly, they don't. And then I thought, well, I might be wrong, and it could just be this increase in transmission. What that would require is a few more percent to become infected and then immune before herd immunity is again reached, and that would produce a small number of deaths. Maybe it's tens or hundreds, but it's not tens of thousands. And so I called it secondary ripple. I partly did it because I wasn't sure, and I wanted to show that I have been thorough. And also, in case it actually happened, and then I thought, my God, I've been awful. So I tried to be thorough. I gave the phenomenon serious consideration, then I gave it a name. So if anyone wants to know when did Mike think of that first, you can go and search my timeline. The first time I wrote hashtag secondary ripple, that's the day I thought, there might be. But I still maintain that you wouldn't actually be able to detect it because the first wave has gone through. Most people are now immune or not susceptible. The remaining, there's a tiny number of people who could be infected, but you can't get this runaway infection. That's what herd immunity does. It doesn't mean you can't catch it. It means it can't accelerate away. And so I just wanted to check that if winter weather increased transmission, and if that demanded a higher level of immunity for the herd immunity threshold to be applying, that would lead to a few more people who might die. And I gave that term, that phenomenon term, secondary ripple. But you can't have waves. That you simply can't. And I've asked people on stage, can you just explain to me what was it that made the virus go away the first time? Then it's obvious to people who understand these things that we've got this rapid acceleration of number of deaths in Britain. It was through the end of March and into the early part of April, and it went from not very many to thousands. It was over 1,000 a day. But this did not last long, and within a period of a few days or a week or so, the number of deaths stopped increasing, but stayed constant for a few days, and then began what we later saw was an inexorable fall, I think, for 11 or 12 weeks, without any wiggles in the line. It just fell constantly. And in retrospect, the interpretation is very clear that what caused the infection to turn was erosion of the susceptible population to a point where the infection could no longer accelerate away, in other words, aka herd immunity. And what allowed it to continue falling right to the end was also herd immunity. And that's why when we had many demonstrations from Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, we then had a period where the restrictions were lifted and tens of thousands of people, like they do in Britain, rushed to the seaside. And so we had all our crowded beaches, and there were photographs in the tabloid papers of literally, you could hardly walk through the beach, so people crowded together. And lots of people said, oh, wait for 2 or 3 weeks and we're going to get all these deaths. And we never did. Yeah. So it never happened. And that's because all the time, the population was no longer susceptible to an accelerating outbreak. There was probably no doubt some people who caught it. But again, you wouldn't detect this have a PCR test. You'd never even know what they were made ill by and died from. But we never saw a re-acceleration and a second wave of any kind. And so my question to honourable colleagues in SAGE is, well, how do you think it's going to occur now? How did it terminate last time? They don't seem to have an opinion. But if you then tell them what's most likely the cause, and then ask them, well, and how can second wave occur? They just kind of say, well, but second wave. They can't justify it. Anyway, so that's why. So what SAGE got wrong is they discounted any possibility of prior immunity in the population, and they argued it from a precautionary principle, and they did not modify their estimate even when really good scientific data was out, which was in the late spring, early summer. So that's one thing, and they have not modified it now. And then they said towards the end of May that they made an estimate of the percent who'd been infected and decided it was 7% from a not very sensitive test of antibodies, and then, of course, became fearful that almost everyone was still susceptible, and so hence the second wave. But people, even with modest experience in the field like me and Claire, who came along later, we realized that what caused the infection, the infective episode to turn in the spring was erosion of susceptible people to a level of herd immunity. And then you can now see the data from T cells, from high sensitivity antibody tests that tell you indeed, yes, there are too few people susceptible for what we are being told is happening to happen. And I'm afraid at that point in the year, sometime in the mid-late summer, I switched from mild and irritation that the experts who are supposed to be taking care of my country and me and my family were just incredibly inexpert and stupid. I went from that concern to fear, because now they're telling me things are going to happen that I know are impossible, immunologically impossible. And then they started to happen. That is increasing number of cases and deaths. And I thought, there's something wrong. This is very bad, because it can't be happening, and they're telling us it is. And around that time, actually, Claire and I bump into each other and have been working together because we're both, I think, very good scientists. We have different skill sets. Claire is a pathologist, and I'm not even a physician, but I am a very experienced scientist. And we bring different things to the examination. And we both arrived, I think, at the conclusion that there's something seriously wrong with the test. We should talk about PCR test. And it's worse now than it was in the spring, because they were doing a little of it in the spring and now a lot of it. And the country is, our country and your country are now locked in this, what I think is an incorrect narrative that the virus is on the loose, that it's spreading like crazy, asymptomatic transmission is important. No such thing. You've heard of this. And so we need to test as many people as possible every day if possible, and then isolate people if we can, even if they're young and healthy. And in that way, we may eventually get on top of this virus. Whereas I'm sure Claire would agree with me that what we probably need to do is turn off the incorrect, error-prone mass PCR testing and wait a few weeks, and then everything will be normal. That's it.
Let me explain this, and I'm going to summarize this. I know, however, that most of the people who are listening will revisit this over and over and over again, and I'm glad they will, because many of the viewers are scientists who will be able to follow you. So I'll translate this into German. Also die Grundannahme, dass die noch infizierbaren Teile der Bevölkerung immer riesengroß waren, in Höhe von, ich glaube, 93%, und dass man hinterher mit diesen Antibody-Tests feststellen können würde, ob es weniger geworden ist oder nicht. Die ist komplett falsch, sagt er. Insbesondere gab es keine zweite Welle, es hat es noch nie gegeben, sondern er bezeichnet es als zweites Wellchen, Second Ripple, hat er gesagt, ne? Und zwar ist es so, dass er schon im Sommer feststellen konnte, dass die Anzahl der Infektionen massiv zurückgegangen war und dass die Immunität innerhalb der Bevölkerung so hoch war, dass man von, wie er vorhin schon gesagt hat, von Herdenimmunität sprechen kann. Einfach deshalb, weil sowieso schon 32% infiziert waren oder irgendwie mit dem Virus in Kontakt gekommen waren und 30% hatten eine vorausgegangene Immunität. Er sagt, ohne dass ich jetzt auf seine Details eingehe, weil ich mich mit denen auch wahrscheinlich verdaddeln würde als Nichtmediziner, er sagt, eine entscheidende Sache, im Sommer oder bis zum Sommer hat er nur gedacht, naja, ein bisschen komisch, was hier abgeht, ich bin ein bisschen skeptisch. Und seit dem Sommer, wo er sieht, dass die Zahlen, die von dieser Gruppe von SAGE genannt werden, nichts mehr mit der Realität zu tun haben, sagt er, seitdem hat er Angst, dass hier bewusst an irgendwas gedreht wird. Ich muss mal gucken, ob ich noch was vergessen habe. Ich glaube, wir kommen jetzt auf die PCR-Tests wahrscheinlich rüber. Habe ich was vergessen? Wahrscheinlich, ne?
Das ist aber eine recht gute Zusammenfassung gewesen.
Claire, you're a pathologist, right?
Right.
And so what are your findings?
So let me start at the beginning. Actually, this is probably the best way to explain it. If you look at the cases we've had recently that are PCR positive, and they've gone off shooting up in that high curve, and you compare it to other things that should correlate. So first of all, you compare it to symptoms on symptom trackers or patients phoning up symptom things or visiting their GP, all that kind of thing. And there was a little bump in September of an increase of symptoms when people went back to school and back to university. It happens every year. And the two correlated for a while, and people worried, oh no, here comes the second wave. But the positive tests carried on their own track. And then you could say, well, you know, we've got patients in hospital who are diagnosed with this. So maybe they're not phoning up and putting stuff into apps. They're going to the emergency room in the hospital straight away. So if you look at that data, there is a plateau at the moment of people coming for an acute respiratory infection. And normally at this time of year, it's rising. And we have a deficit of 300. You know what? I could show you a PowerPoint presentation of this, if that might help. Show you the graphs.
Yeah.
Yeah, then we have to share the screen.
Yes, please.
Yes.
So you're seeing a plateau of serious respiratory illnesses when normally at this time of the year, such cases would be rising.
That's right.
So the measures work. Eureka!
Okay, hang on one more second, and while Viviane is trying to put this on the screen, ich mache noch mal eine Ergänzung eben. Er sagte, also Mike Jeden sagte noch, er ist also jetzt sogar durchaus beängstigt, dass hier irgendwas passiert und dass hier mit der Bevölkerung was gemacht wird, was keinerlei Sinn macht, weil der Gesamtzusammenhang ziemlich deutlich ist, nämlich derjenige, dass die PCR-Tests offenbar benutzt werden, indem man sie anschiebt, um immer mehr positive Zahlen zu produzieren. So wie am Anfang seiner Ausführung er gesagt hat, solange die Bevölkerung an diese beiden falschen Tatsachenbehauptungen glaubt, nämlich einerseits daran, dass man mit PCR-Tests Infektionen feststellen kann und zweitens, dass es asymptomatische Infektionen gibt, wird man einen Grund haben, scheinbar jedenfalls, jeden zu testen, und zwar für immer, weil man ja immer Leute ohne Symptome sieht, also immer die Gefahr hat, dass diese symptomlosen Leute hochgefährlich sind. Und Claire, die ist Pathologin, Claire Craig sagte eben, dass die normalerweise um diese Jahreszeit, also aus ihrer Sicht passen die positiven Zahlen, positiven Testergebnisse nicht zu den realen Krankheiten, die sie berichtet. Normalerweise würde es um diese Zeit einen Anstieg der Lungenkrankheiten geben, der Respiratory Illnesses geben. Ist aber nicht so, sondern es hat sich ein Plateau gebildet. Claire, I'm going to let you continue while my people are trying to put these your charts on the screen.
Okay, so this discrepancy of people who should have been coming to hospital with an acute respiratory infection is about 300 patients per day. And then we have a new category of people coming to hospital of COVID-19. Which rises at the same rate that should have been rising, and the discrepancy, and they've got to about 200. So some of this seems to be a misclassification.
One second. Maybe could you request the screen share?
Because then it'll be possible.
On the right-hand side on this list of.
At the bottom.
You know, at the bottom on the right-hand side, that we can accept your request.
Okay.
Certainly on mine, Claire, there's a button that says share screen. I don't know whether you've got that.
Yeah, I've got the share screen, but I just get told that the host has enabled that. And I can't find any other way of doing it.
Could you just email?
Yeah, let me just email it to you, and then you've got
Yeah,
it.
yeah, and then we'll put it up. We'll put it up on our website.
Ja,
Viviane, du müsstest das freigeben.
Ja, ich weiß aber nicht, wo es jetzt anzuklicken ist.
Du musst unten bei dem grünen Schild musst du es freigeben. Wenn du da drauf drückst, da kommt da drunter ein Menü, da kannst du sagen freigeben für andere User.
So that was Professor Wodak explaining to us how to share the screen.
Das geht nicht. Ich weiß nicht, dann wird es wieder unseres wird geteilt zu werden.
For some reason, we're too stupid to do this.
Well, I'm definitely too stupid.
Okay, it's on its way to Germany.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Claire.
Okay, so we've got this new category, and if you look across the country, different parts of the country are using this new category. And so we have new regions that seem to be miscategorizing. And then let me then talk about PCR, how PCR testing can go wrong, right? So PCR testing is one of the most reliable medical tests when it's done well. And so people have a lot of faith in it because they're looking for a sequence that's complex. And so it's hard to mistake things for this complex sequence. So yeah, there is too much faith in it, I would say. But we know from past experience that it can go wrong. And there's this phenomenon of a false positive pseudo-epidemic, which has been written about in the medical literature, where PCR testing particularly, it can happen with other tests, but it's particularly with PCR testing, you can create the illusion of an epidemic. And it's difficult to prove you're not in one, but I have attended lectures where I have been taught how you prove you're not in one. So I can prove to you that we're not in one. Mm-hmm. The thing that's obvious to everybody is that you don't have the excess deaths, right? That's the critical thing. You have deaths that are labeled with this disease, but there's no excess death. Now, we're in a tricky situation at the moment because there are non-COVID excess deaths sometimes. We had that in the spring. And, when people can't access healthcare and when people aren't staffing ambulances because the ambulance staff have a cough and they have to stay home, then people die. So that becomes a bit tricky. But the other way that you prove it is that you look at the way the data points relate to each other. Have we got the PowerPoint?
Haben wir das Ding jetzt gekriegt? Nee, for some reason she can't get a hold of it. It's probably, the thing is we won't be able to show it on the screen if it's only here by email.
Schick das an ovalfilm@gmail.com. Ich kann das versuchen.
Okay,
das dauert dann vielleicht 5 Minuten, bis ich das eingebunden habe.
If you send it, what's the email address again?
I have it.
Okay.
But where did she send it to?
Where did you send it?
To whoever sent me the Zoom link. So it was to Corvin.
Okay, so we're going to have to send it to oval, OVAL, at gmail.com. And then oval, OVAL at gmail.com. I'll translate in the meantime. Also sie sagt, das Problem mit den PCR-Tests, die angeblich hier so ganz genau eine Pandemie abbilden, ist, dass die zwar im Grundsatz ganz toll sind und kleinste Sequenzen, um die es hier jetzt auch gehen wird, sichtbar machen können, die das menschliche Auge nicht sehen kann. Aber hier in diesem Zusammenhang wird eine Pandemie nur vorgespiegelt durch diese ganzen Positivtests. Sie wird das sicherlich gleich erklären. Man hat die Positivtests, aber man hat auf der anderen Seite keine dazu passenden Krankheits- und Todesraten. Es gibt sowohl hier in Deutschland als auch in England so gut wie keine überschießende Mortalität. Und diejenigen überschießenden Mortalitäten, die es gibt, die sind offensichtlich, ich frage Sie gleich nochmal genauer, nicht durch Covid, sondern durch was anderes verursacht worden. So if you're talking about how there is no real correlation between the number of positive test results and then you have no excess deaths, or even if you do, they're not caused by COVID. And you're saying from your years of practice and your training, you can definitely tell that this is no COVID pandemic, but, and I'm using my own words, but a PCR test pandemic. Is that?
Yes, so the next bit is the proof. So the next bit is to say, if you imagine there's a funnel.
Yeah.
So top of the funnel, you've got all the people in the population that could have COVID that you try to get a number from by doing random population testing. Mm-hmm. So number here. Out of that number, a percentage every week will be diagnosed with a COVID in the community. Mm-hmm. That number, a percentage go to hospital, mm-hmm. and a percentage go onto intensive care, and then there are deaths, which is the smallest number. Mm-hmm. But they all relate to each other in a proper way. You know, the percentages should be the same, mm-hmm. unless something else changes. And the something else, of course, is that you increase testing. So your cases can balloon, but you should know that that's because the cases ballooned. So it means that you can look at percentages. So the first percentage you look at is how many deaths are there per case. And it's up at the really high in spring. And then over time, it comes down and down and down because we do more testing, we get more mild cases. And so the deaths per case reduce. And it gets to summer and it's very, very low. But in September, it goes up like it substantially goes up. The deaths per hospital admission, they do exactly the same thing. Up in the spring. Same shape. So there's 3 sources of evidence that tells us COVID got more deadly, okay? Then you look at it in a different way and you say, well, how about the relationship between how many hospital admissions there are per case? And that fell and is still falling. And the number of ICU beds per case fell and is still falling. So COVID has got less severe. So we have a disease that's more deadly and less severe. You can't have that in biology. That doesn't work. So the only exception I think I could think of was, right, what if people are dying suddenly in the community from clots? So I checked where people are dying, and 80% of the COVID deaths are in hospital. So it doesn't make sense.
So you're saying with your funnel model, you're saying if you look at the population and you're using this funnel, then we have a large percentage of the population who test positive, a much smaller percentage of the population who show symptoms and actually fall ill, and even smaller percentage of the population that has to go to the hospital, and the smallest percentage, of course, is those who die.
Yes.
And this pattern, or no, then you're looking at how I think you're talking about the case fatality rate, not the infection fatality rate, right?
That's right.
You're saying the case fatality rate is such that in in spring is very high, then in the summer it's really low, and now in September it was way up again. What's the next step? I missed the next step of your argument.
So this is also true of deaths.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
So it's also true of deaths per hospital admission.
Yeah.
And of deaths per intensive care bed.
Yeah.
The deaths are rising in proportion to a lot of the measures.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you look at hospital admissions per case and intensive care beds per case, those are falling.
Mm-hmm.
It's more deadly and less severe.
How do we make sense of this?
Because instead of them, each data point should relate to the disease. So each data point should have that regular relationship with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Each data point instead relates to only the test and the testing.
I got it.
Errors. They can do whatever they want, what they tend to do. And the mathematical proof of it isn't in the PowerPoint, actually, and I haven't shared it a lot because it's complicated, but I'll tell you anyway. If you include the lags between a case and a hospital death, then you look at the ratios of the data, they just are all over the place. If you take out the lags and just say, tell me what it looks like on the day the test is done, they're really neat. So they correlate the wrong way round. You expect the correlations to not work when you look at just the test date. And you look at the lags, it all fits in because it's a real disease. But if you look at it without the lags, that's when it's all fitting in because it's related.
Wow. Yes, Claire, I know this story because you've described it to me several times, and my genuine fear is people could listen to this again and again and again and not understand. So, so this is I just wanted to offer. So Claire has described how there is, as it were, uncoupling or lack of linkage between the claim that someone is, quote, ill with COVID and the happening of their death. And she's followed that through all sorts of measures through the healthcare system. And it is compelling. And that means they are dying. These are people who are dying. But we don't think there's, whatever it is that's killing them, it's not the same thing as was killing them in spring, because all the relationships are wrong. And the easiest way to explain it is that the test and this diagnosis, quotes, COVID is incorrect because there's something wrong with the testing system. So I think it's worth just very briefly, and you might need lots of information, but so Claire has described how there's this uncoupling between the result of testing, PCR, and the death, and basically arrives at an astonishing conclusion that we're not in the middle of an epidemic of deaths. So there's two things. I'll leave Claire to describe how we know this for absolute certain, some astonishing data that came to our way in the early part of this week in a moment. But I think it's maybe just worth me taking a minute or so to describe how it is that PCR test that Claire described as wonderful within its, in lots of ways, how could it go so badly wrong? Because I do believe, just from a scientific perspective, it has done. I won't take too much time, but we can come back to it. So it is a very good technique. As Claire said, it's a technique where if you've got the conditions right and you use what are called primers, they're pieces of genetic information that are designed to be complementary to the thing that you're looking for. So they're a really good fit only for the thing you're looking for. And so if the test finds it, then you'd be able to say, yes, what I was looking for is present. And it can do it on tiny samples because it's an amplification technique. It can amplify again and again and again. If you understand even basic mathematical functions, if I say, 2 to the power of 4, you'll know that that's 4, 8, 16, 32, is it? Yeah. 2 to the power of 4. Yeah. But if I say 2 to the power of 40, you'll be kind of reeling and falling around and thinking, hold on, are there more grains of sand on the beach or stars in the sky than this or whatever? The answer's probably. But it's a very, very, very big number. And yet that is the number of cycles. That is the power function that's being used in this amplification technique. So it's really, really good. My God, you have to watch it. So originally, when the technique was set up and designed, and I don't know anything about the people doing that, but I'm sure they picked so-called primers. These are these bits of bait that you would put in, and then it would amplify again and again up to 40 power functions, 2 to the 40. And it's got a little bit of something fluorescent or whatever, light absorbing. And so you'll be able to see a color appearing or fluorescence appearing or whatever as time goes on. So this thing, they can validate it and show that it responds to a bit of virus, and then you think, well, and you're off, and you should be able to go off to the races. Well, it's not so fast. There are several basic steps that I've lost. Several basic steps you need to go through. So you need to check, for example, that the test might pick up the virus, but does it pick up anything else? And so you look and check that it doesn't respond to lots of other things. So that would be so it doesn't produce false positives by lighting up when something other than what you're looking for is in the test. And ultimately, you run the test a few hundred times in a laboratory and just check when you haven't added the virus, how many times does it come up positive? Because I assure you it does. That's true of all mass testing, that occasionally it goes wrong and it'll say that I've got a positive, found the virus, when in fact the virus isn't there. And the way you estimate how often that occurs is by deliberately and systematically loading some of the test systems with a blank that you know does not contain the virus. And you run it a few hundred times, and every now and again it says virus present. That's called a false positive. Now there's half a dozen ways in which you can get a false positive. That is, it says I'm positive even though the virus isn't there. And we probably don't have time to go through all of them. But the point is they occur. False positives occur. Positives also occur. Sometimes you put the virus in and ask, after hundreds of runs, how many times does it say to you, actually, no virus found? And you know that's a mistake because you put it in yourself. So, but these things, rather than trying to guess it, what you do is you test it. And you don't just test it in the lab that designed it. That's called a laboratory test of intrinsic performance. How selective is it? How specific is it? But what you must do is really important. And every time you change the conditions of the test, you must do it again. It's called the operational false positive rate. The operational false positive rate doesn't have to bear any resemblance whatsoever to the sort of intrinsic accuracy of the test, not at all. And the reason why it doesn't is because most of the errors are introduced in, as it were, in the field, as you use them, as you prepare the sample, as you transfer into apparatus. That's where all the mistakes are being made. So if you just relied on the performance of the PCR itself, just the end stage amplification, and say, well, that's the accuracy. You know, it never gets it wrong more than 1 in 1,000, which is lots of politicians have done this all year, and they've even criticised me for saying, how dare you suggest that the false positives? I've looked at the spec sheets and there aren't. And I've said, well, you haven't determined the operational false positive rate. And so I'm probably the most famous person who's infamous person who's criticised the government consistently on this point, to the point that I've even tangled with the country's most famous statistician. He's kind of criticised me and said I've just got it wrong, and I honestly haven't, Sir David. Anyway, I'll cut long to short. It is possible to have false positive rates that are all of the positive. So this is a stunner. It is possible to have conditions such that all of the positives are false ones. For example, if you have contamination in a lab. So every time you put your piece of apparatus for maybe transferring liquids around, it might be called a micropipette. If you put it down, and unknown to you, there is like 1 trillionth of a piece of whatever it is that might contaminate it. That is, you can't see it. You might even have cleaned it 3 times and it's still there. You put your pipette down and it touches it, and now you use it to transfer some liquid. There might be enough pieces of RNA to be positive in a test that goes 2 to the power of 40. So you don't even need to work out how it happens. That's not what you do. What you do is you test the damn thing in the field. You get a third party or someone blinded to the procedure to actually test how are your assays performing today in a big warehouse, you know, in an out-of-town industrial park, because that's how they're doing it in Britain now. And you feed them lots of samples and you see how the assay does. And they have never done it. I've been badgering the UK government and its ministers for months. And eventually, I mean, lots of people, I wrote what's called a written question to Parliament. They are obligated, if the question is proper and it's done in the correct way, they are obligated, I think, within 2 weeks to give you a written answer. And they file it in what's called Hansard, which is the written record of the Parliament for the last 1,000 years. So it's a pretty serious thing. You're not allowed to lie. You're not allowed not to answer the question. So if the question is properly bounded, so I asked them to give them the operational false positive rates for every week of October. And if they didn't have it, the closest estimate in October. And if they didn't have the reports, the draft report. So I was very, very, very specific. And I kind of know it was me that did it, because eventually the admission on the says, we have determined the operational false positive rate a number of times, but have not succeeded. Consequently, government does not possess the number we asked for. We do not know what the operational false positive rate is. Now, to those of us who understand mass testing, and it was not my area of expertise, but I've definitely done it in the pharmaceutical industry, at this point I would go around to the person running the assay and say, just explain yourself to me. And the answer, you know, I'm under such pressure, Mike, that, you know what, I'm just not bothered to test it, can you just go away? You know, that would not be acceptable, because the conclusion from not knowing and not having tested the operational false positive rate is this, that if you've got 1,000 positives, it's impossible to justify saying whether one of those is genuine, 10 of them are genuine, 100 of them are genuine, or 1,000 of them are genuine. It's literally impossible from a scientific standpoint, statistical standpoint, legal, forensic standpoint, and yet they're using them to crush my country. And so you almost don't need to know any more than that. This is important, Ryan, for the purpose of a legal fight, because I'm confident that when you ask, and I bet some of your scientists have asked, I bet Germany does not know the operational false positive rates. If they do, I'd love to see the result. Also, I would want to know that they did it last week and last month as well, and not just in April, carefully in the lab. And the reason I say this is because, and Claire and I have looked at this, early in the spring, most of the PCR tests were being performed in hospital labs. So a big regional hospital would have its own microbiology lab where they would grow out organisms to see what bacterium you have. And they would also maybe have a molecular biology lab, and they had clever people there who, that's what they did for a living. They're properly trained people. And so some of the tests were being done in hospital labs. Some were being done in what's called the Public Health Laboratory Service. When I was young, Britain had a very, very good PHLS, Public Health Laboratory Service, and almost every town would have a little lab nearby for disease outbreaks. This is how we used to do it when we were a proper country. And then more recently, we've centralized this so that there were a small number of labs, and they're still very good. They are public labs. They've often been put out to private tender, but they're still very good people. I know some people who work in the Public Health Laboratory Service. So that's how the tests were being done when they were doing a few thousand a day, mainly on patients, people who were coming in through the door and they were ill. They would swab them and send the test off to the lab or to the Public Health Laboratory Services. But the point I'm going to make is hundreds of different people, certainly scores of different people, were doing the test every day. The wonderful thing about that is if one of them makes a mistake and the other one doesn't, you can see it. You know, you can start to see big changes. If, let's say, there were 30 swabs taken in Manchester and 1,000 in London, if one lab produced and then all of the results were positive instead of only 1%, you'd know there was a problem, right? Because you could compare. So that's what they were doing in spring, and I think there was a good relationship, and Claire will confirm this, a good relationship between a diagnosis of COVID by PCR and what happened to the patient later in terms of their fate, whether they survived or not. It was good. Unfortunately, in the spring, maybe inspired by SAGE, who told them there was going to be a second wave, they decided they weren't going to have PCR testing done like this anymore by expert people in lots of different labs. They decided to industrialize the process. And now we have in Britain, I think there are either 6 or 8, I think it's 8, and they call them lighthouse labs. But basically they're temporary labs that have been set up in out-of-town industrial parks. So they probably hired a warehouse somewhere, maybe several warehouses, and they will have equipped them with flow hoods and PCR machines, and this is all very good. But the problem is that we don't have enough experienced staff in the country to do the next step that I'm going to describe, which is because they're testing, they claim to be testing 300,000 or more tests a day. Every one of those swabs that you've seen on the TV, somebody has to take it out carefully, do something with that, and they have to manipulate the liquid very carefully and very precisely. Often there are several steps because the sample is quite dirty, it contains maybe bacteria. You might centrifuge it, you might take the sample and put it in a microcentrifuge and spin it down and then take some of the liquid. So every single sample, you'll be handling it a number of times, very carefully, but handling it a number of times. And if you've got 300,000 samples, even if it's only a few steps, you can suddenly see how many, potentially millions of manual handling steps that takes. Now, in the spring, they seconded from universities people like me 35 years ago, as I was a postdoc, I was a student doing my PhD, and they would say, excuse me, there's a medical emergency in your country. You're used to working in the lab. Will you put your lab coat on and come and help? And I would say, certainly. And so in the spring, lots of people doing this test at great speed and pressure. It was a helpful effort, were people like Claire and I when we were young. They would work 12-hour shifts, and they were really, really careful. And I think the test worked well because the results were reliable. But as they went up, throttle up by another 10-fold or 15-fold, and now they're doing 300,000 tests a day, there just aren't enough PhD students willing to give up their life and go and work in a windy warehouse. And so what they've started to do, what they have been doing for months now, they advertise for laboratory scientists. And unfortunately, quite a lot of people who degree 3 or 4 years ago, and since then they've been selling shoes or working in an insurance company. Or one of them was a DJ. So they do have a degree in science. Almost none of them have any experience professionally of working in a laboratory. And the last time they were in a laboratory was one of the 10 laboratories they had during their degree in that particular topic. That's the only time they ever used a pipette. And these people are now running PCR tests or doing the sample preparation for our nation. It's not their fault. I absolutely attach no blame whatsoever to any of the hardworking people who are doing this. So here's the point. I'm comparing what was done in spring, where lots of very experienced separate labs were doing it, and the data looked good, and Dr. Craig will tell you that it actually married up with fatality. And what they're doing now is centralized testing in brand new labs, largely at the bench, staffed by people who've never done this for a living. And then I ask you, don't you think you would really want to know what the operational false positive rate of the installation was now? And the answer is you don't want to know it, because it's not going to be the same as it was in spring. And it probably was only 1% in spring. 1% of the positives were false. And I'll just briefly pause because lots of people get confused at this. If only 1% of the positives are false, why am I complaining? This isn't a problem, 1%. Yeah, but what happens if only 0.5% of the samples actually contain virus? Well, that means possibly 0.5% of the positives you're seeing were of people with virus, but the other half are false positives. In other words, at best, 50% of the positives are real and 50% are not. What happens if, in fact, as it was true in the summer, there are only 0.1% of the samples are positive? You've got 1% of the samples being positive. That means 9 out of 10 of them are not real. And that's with a number like 1%. It's a very important concept. So basically, it's a better way to ask it is, what percentage of false diagnoses is a better way of describing it to people? What percentage of false diagnoses? And you know what? The government's not even measured that, so they don't know. And my belief is that there were times in the summer when I think the false diagnosis rate was probably about 90%. It wasn't complete, but most of them were not real. But I now think there's good evidence to believe that fundamentally all the positives are now false. And I say this because I've seen traces, I think from Scotland rather than England, where the percentage of tests that were positive has been an absurd 11%. Like, so 1 in 9 people. Yeah. It's just not immunologically plausible that 1 in 9 people of a random sample, these are not people with symptoms, a random sample, have the virus. For a start, I don't think there was ever a time in this epidemic when not 1 in 9 people had it. And yet there they are gaily churning the handle on this test. And I've seen, it says 11% positivity. That means the virus is getting worse. And I say, no, it tells you your test is utterly broken. And then when I ask them, what's the operational false positive rate? And they go, we don't know. You can see the collision here. And Claire will describe in a moment what she has already described, how there isn't any connection anymore between a positive PCR test and what happens to the person in terms of illness and death. And we think the reason is because there isn't any virus anymore, effectively no virus. We're not saying 0 cases, but it's asymptotically at the bottom now. It's sort of plateaued at low level. And you can see how the misdiagnosis with PCR could occur, because I've just, I think, reasonably fairly described an industrialized process done by inexperienced people where no one has done the basic checks to see what the performance is like. So they don't even know if it's wrong. My note to myself was, in a normal lab, yes, in a normal lab, you have quality assurance, quality control, and error recognition. You have in your mind as a lab supervisor, how would I know if it's gone wrong? And you know the answer to this question. So because you've got to do that to preserve the integrity of your test. I believe no one's doing that job at all right now. So where was I going to go with this? I was going to just mention a couple of other things. That one way you avoid this being a problem is you retest positives. And in all previous epidemics, we would retest positives because there aren't very many. Not very many people would have this infectious disease. And so if you're doing 1,000 tests and 1% are positive, that's only 10. So it's not difficult to take those 10 and retest them. And if they're positive again, then you're really, really sure. And we used to have that discipline, and we've forgotten it, and we don't ever do it in mass testing. So they don't retest positives. Oh yes, and then I talked earlier about amplification cycles. Yeah. We knew early in the outbreak, understandably, that although PCR is not a great quantifying technique, we knew broadly that if you had a lot of virus in your sample, you didn't need to amplify many times before it became positive. But if you had very little virus, you would probably need to amplify 2 to the power of 40 or 2 to the power of 38 before it became positive. We knew, because someone had studied it and published it, that there's a broad relationship. So basically tests associated with a low number of cycles, what they did is they tried to culture virus from the sample. Because if the virus is really there, be able culture. Well, when I say culture the virus, you should be able to infect some naive cells with the virus to which they're susceptible and watch it grow out over a couple of days. And they did do that, and they found that people who were positive tested PCR, but only at a small number of amplification cycles, they found that was associated with a good success rate of culturing virus. It all ties together. Lots of virus, don't need very many amplification cycles to get a positive, were able to culture. But I'm afraid the other end was also true. When the positive test was associated with a high number of amplification cycles, they couldn't culture virus at all, ever. In other words, if your test is associated with what's called a cycle threshold of, say, 38, on no occasion did they ever manage to culture virus from the sample. In other words, you could say, well, doesn't that mean a positive test at that level isn't meaningful, they're not infected or infectious? And there are probably some small exceptions to that statement, but broadly, yes. There isn't enough virus in that sample to be able to declare the person, quote, infected. And you'd think, well, that's good news. Why wouldn't they immediately modify the technique and put a cutoff on the amplification cycles? You know, that would make the thing much more efficient and accurate. And they were told to do it, and they didn't. They just kept the throttle going until basically they've got the foot on the throttle until it reaches max RPM. They're still running it at I think in Britain it's running at a cycle threshold of 40. I think it's 40, which is, it's absurd in principle. And now we've got the data, which we had it 5 months ago. Now we understand the relationship broadly between becoming positive in the PCR test at a low number of amplification cycles and the ability to culture virus, and the inability ever to do that if you're positive at high numbers of amplification cycles. Then I think that means the authorities are prepared to run the test, even though a number of samples, and they don't tell you how many because they never tell you the cycle threshold, but they're prepared to entertain the possibility that a lot of cycles, a lot of PCR tests that are positive have occurred at cycle amplification, numbers of amplification cycles that are not consistent with having virus. In other words, they would be a kind of non-infectious positive. And again, we've tried desperately. I've written to various people to say, have you seen this paper showing that you don't need to go beyond 32? And I never get replies, or they're courteous replies that says, but nevertheless, we're going to carry on per protocol, whatever it is. So bottom line is, I've given you, I think, people who listen to this ample reason to be concerned that in the autumn, at least, the conditions under which PCR tests are being run are problematic because they're run by inexperienced people in a centralized lab, and there's no evidence of normal sort of error detection, quality assurance work. And specifically, I wrote to the government and they wrote to us through Hansard that we do not know the operational false positive rate. Now, at that point, if this was a medical diagnostic test, say, for testicular cancer, Rainer, and we learned this about the test, you would not subject yourself to the test, because you would realize it doesn't matter what the answer is, it's not meaningful. When I've got a positive test, doctor, what does this mean? They'd go, I have no idea. Seriously, that's how bad it is. That's how bad it is. And so
it's very bad. That is very
exactly
bad.
That's why I've used this example, because damn it, this is a medical diagnostic test being used on the population. It's just being used in a mass fashion instead of an individual one for me, the patient, or for you, the patient. But it's the same principle, and you should apply the same discipline, which is to know the operational false positive rates. How many times does it miss the illness when you've got it? How many times does it find the illness when you don't have it? They don't know the answer, and I can't tell you how cross I am. So I'm now going to pause and ask Claire to describe something basically the authorities have revealed themselves, which I don't think they really quite understood. And if you don't get anything else about what I've said, and you find it too difficult to follow what Claire said, just accept these things, that this is a plain virus, by which I mean it is stable. It doesn't mutate quickly like flu. So once you've had it, you are immune, because that's the way the human immune system works in the normal healthy person. And that means if you see it again, you're very unlikely to get ill, because your immune system will recognize it and fight it off. So, and then the background I mentioned earlier is lots of people were immune, and lots of people have been infected, survived, and they are immune. And as a result, it's impossible, I believe impossible, to have the phenomenon of enormous epidemic coronavirus in the UK. So that means straight away you're looking for something wrong, because I've just described that it's impossible for what they say is happening to be happening. And very quickly we alight on, oh my God, the PCR test is being run in a way we've never done before, in a way that would be likely to make the error rate higher in experienced people in a strange context. And then, God damn it, just to convict them, they haven't even measured the operational false positive rate. I think that's enough to say stop using it on its own. But I'm now going to send it over to Claire, because Claire, England recorded the highest number of new coronavirus infections in a day. Claire, it was 33,470, but there's something you might want to tell us about testing elsewhere in the country recently.
Can I quickly interject and translate, because all of this is getting lost on some of our viewers. And in order
the last bit's very, very quick.
Yeah, but let me.
You might.
You mean Claire's bit? Okay, fine.
Well, Claire, it could be, or do you think? Yeah, but you know what, Rainer, I think why not let Rainer translate, because he's pointing out that one, I've talked too quickly, two, our stuff is quite complicated without figures. And three, some of his audience in Austria, Switzerland, and Germany don't speak English. So he was going to do a paraphrase in German while we have a little break.
And in order to make sure that I'm not getting you wrong, let me summarize first in English. We are still in agreement when it comes to the basic question or the basic assessment that PCR tests are not admitted for diagnostic purposes, meaning, and that's what Kerry Mullis says in all his videos, meaning you cannot use this piece. It's a great test, but you cannot use it in order to check whether somebody is infected with something or even ill. So that's...
You shouldn't use it on its own. Would that be correct, Claire?
Yeah, it's good corroborative evidence.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to translate that first. Also eins steht fest, der Test alleine kann nichts über Infektionen aussagen. If you do it correctly, however, you can, let me put it this way, zero in so that many of the false positives, if you do it correctly, are avoided, right?
There will always be some.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. But,
it's not very relevant.
Okay, and what you're so upset about, Mike, is that the government, even you pose them these questions to Parliament. We have a very similar instrument here in Germany. Wie heißt das? Parlamentarische Anfrage. Questions to Parliament. Did they not answer, or did they refuse to answer, or did they say we can't tell you anything, or what?
So they for weeks and weeks they dissembled, and then eventually, because I worked a pincer movement on the health minister, Mr. Hancock, with the host of a talk radio show called Talk Radio. So you can look this up. It was Julia Hartley Brewer, and she interviewed the health minister, Mr. Hancock. I think it was in June or July, and she asked him the question again and again: what is the operational or the false positive rate? And eventually he confessed it's just under 1%. He just sort of mumbled it under his breath as if he was embarrassed about it. So that was an admission, but I've got to tell you something important, and I don't think he knew it. It's considered a very, very bad thing in our democracy for any MP, but particularly a minister of the government, to lie. That is, to knowingly say something that's not true. And the worst place to do it is in the House of Commons. If you will be fired or asked. If you don't immediately apologise for your misspeaking or whatever, it would be considered an extremely bad thing. So Matthew Hancock didn't say it in the House of Parliament, but he did say it live on a radio show that you can go and find now. And what he said was the false positive rate is just under 1%. Unfortunately, that's not true, because we've now learned in October that not only then, but never have they measured the operational false positive rate. So the number he quoted, and I don't actually think he knew that, poor man. I think someone just told him what to say, because he's not a scientist. I think the number they quoted, which is just astonishing gall, they quoted the number from an internal scientist, a government scientist, wrote critically, very politely, but very critically, to Sage on June the 3rd, 2020, one of the authors was a Dr. K. Baker. I don't remember the other person, but they basically said PCR test for SARS-CoV-2, as far as we can tell from looking at all the documents internally and all the scientific literature, has never been tested for its operational false positive rate. In other words, it's a diagnostic test that's not ready for use because we don't understand even the basic parameters about it when actually put in use. And then they went very carefully through saying what will happen if you don't know this and then you use it, and it will model various error rates. They're saying, here are some plausible error rates because we've looked at half a dozen similar techniques. So we've looked at the actual error rate from these techniques, and then we've modeled them for you, false negatives, false positive, and it was awful. It was basically, it said very clearly, don't use this test, and for God's sake, not if you haven't characterized it. Apparently, this document, 7 pages, I think, was sent specifically to SAGE. I looked at the minutes of the meeting at which it was filed. It was not mentioned. It's not even an exhibit on the minutes of that meeting. So they decided not to consider it. So there was the clear evidence of a scientist, an honourable person, writing. It probably took courage to do that. I bet it wasn't very popular with their supervisor. So basically, they wrote in to say, we don't know the basic characteristics of this test, this PCR test, and I'm labouring this point because you and I know how important this is. But we shouldn't use this test because we don't understand the operational false positive and negative rates. And they, despite probably the displeasure of their supervisor, they did it anyway, and they wrote to SAGE, which is the best place to go. And it looks like SAGE didn't consider it. Maybe they just dropped it on the floor, but they certainly didn't discuss it. It's not minuted. Dr. Baker and others have sent this test to us, and here is our concern. Here's what we should do about it. The way you would expect, at least a paragraph.
Okay.
Is the of the testing strategy, and it's not being discussed.
Yeah, we have to translate a little. So
Okay.
It doesn't tell you anything about infections if you use only the PCR test.
I think that's
Second,
Claire, you go.
And second, if it does test positive on something, we have to remember that it cannot distinguish, and I'm probably using an unscientific term, dead from live matter. So
that's true.
Okay, it's very possible.
That's
and
true.
according to your estimates, which are in complete agreement with the scientists who we listen to, more than 90% may be false positives. And that may be due to the fact that they're finding fragments of your immune system's fight against the common cold or something, because it cannot tell the difference between whether it's a hot infection, and I think that's your definition of a real infection, hot infection and a cold infection.
Hot versus cold. It's worth just saying, you're trying, actually I can hear you trying to explain how it is that false positives can happen. You're trying to add various things like, I don't even know whether the PCR tests cross-react with common cold coronaviruses. It's been suggested to me, and then I really drilled down with a friend of mine, and he said, I'm not sure. So I decided not to say it anymore because it might be true. But if it's not true, I will damage my credibility. So you can hear I've actually rode back.
I think what's key is that there are lots and lots of
1 second, we have to translate. We have to translate.
I just wanted to make sure that I'm not getting you wrong. Now, at the center of everything, das müssen wir wissen, the operational false positive rate, that is of utmost importance. You inquired about it and you got a wrong answer. Maybe it was an innocent wrong answer, but maybe this politician was fed the wrong answer. We don't know that.
So.
And but in order to give me the opportunity to translate this, what is the operational false positive rate? Does it refer to contamination? Probably does, right? Because that's what Professor
Claire, maybe you were just going to say there's lots of ways in which you can get incorrectly a positive result.
Okay.
Yeah. So the people keep focusing on the equipment, and the equipment have a false positive rate, and it will be low and constant. But the process will have lots of potential variables.
Yeah.
Particular members, like particular populations, might have higher false positive rate. I think people in their 20s have higher false positive rates, which is why we saw that happening. So there's lots of different things going on. At the moment, we've got men testing positive twice as much as women in the community testing.
Ja. Ja, okay. Also das ist jetzt
wir lassen das mal festhalten und gleich nochmal nachfragen.
Das müssen wir Ulrike fragen, Professor Kämmerer fragen, das müssen wir auch Wolfgang Wodak fragen und noch ein paar andere Leute fragen. Also this is an issue that we haven't even been aware of. So we're going to have to talk to our experts about this. Also diese Verfahrensfalschpositiven Raten sind extrem wichtig, weil sie sagt, das hängt davon ab, wen man testet, ob es Frauen oder Männer sind. Das hängt aber natürlich, und das ist ganz wichtig, dass es hier an einer Stelle erwähnt wird, davon ab, wer führt die Tests durch. Und Mike sagte eben am Anfang, in the spring, da wurden diese Tests in den Krankenhäusern durchgeführt, wo die eigene Labore haben und so. Oder in den öffentlichen, in den Public Health Agencies, wo die auch sowas haben. Aber irgendwann nach dem Spring, da änderten die das. Und jetzt gibt es 6 oder 8... Wir haben da ja einmal auch das Robert-Koch-Institut gefragt. So once we asked the Robert-Koch-Institute... Warte mal, Wolfgang, ich will es mal...
Let me please say one thing. It's very important because we asked Robert Koch Institute to tell us the false positive rate and to tell us the positive rate, not the positive rate of the 180 institutions sending their results to Robert Koch Institute. They didn't even tell us that. They didn't have to tell anything about the false positive rate, just to tell us the positive rate. If that would be very different positive rates in neighboring laboratories, we would have a hint where we could search further. But they didn't give us. They didn't know. They want to be blind. And I think this is a very important fact.
Ja, aber lass uns jetzt kurz nochmal weiter.
Das machen wir noch mal kurz fertig. Also, wichtig zu wissen. Also wir haben eben gehört, wir haben hier ein ähnliches Vorgehen gehabt. Es gab auch Anfragen, die ebenfalls nicht beantwortet wurden, obwohl die sich noch nicht mal auf die False Positives bezogen, sondern nur auf die Positivraten. Aber hier ist was passiert in England und das macht ihn sehr besorgt. Die haben diese Tests plötzlich nicht mehr da durchgeführt, wo die Spezialisten sitzen, mit all den Unwägbarkeiten, die wir eben angesprochen haben. Ist überhaupt nicht zugelassen für diagnostische Purposes und wenn die Cycles zu hoch sind, also ab 35 sagt man, ist das alles völlig unbrauchbar. Unsere Tests sind auf 45 eingestellt. Aber hier gibt es eben diese Operational False Positive Rates und die sind da besonders schlimm, auch wenn wir sie gar nicht kennen, wo plötzlich nicht mehr Spezialisten am Ruder sind und nicht mehr die Spezialisten diese Sachen testen, sondern man diese Tests rausgenommen hat aus den Krankenhäusern und den öffentlichen Institutionen, wo die Spezialisten sitzen und in 6 oder 8 große 6 or 8 out-of-town industrial places, da reingepackt hat, in zugigen großen Hallen und das Ganze so industrialisiert hat, weil man eben ganz viel getestet hat, dass man gar nicht mehr genug Leute hatte. Sodass jetzt Leute da am Testen sind, die null Ahnung von gar nichts haben. Zum Beispiel er hat das Beispiel eines DJs genannt. Sicherlich Leute, die sich große Mühe geben. Früher war das so, dass man in solchen Notfällen dann Leute wie ihn, der damals noch studiert hat, aber der einigermaßen schon vielleicht das Physikum hinter sich hatte, da hat man die aus den Krankenhäusern geholt in Notfällen und gesagt, hier, du musst da rein. Jetzt nimmt man Leute, die keine Ahnung haben. And because of this, you're afraid that this is being done on purpose because it's not, it doesn't seem, and to me neither, by the way, this cannot be an accident. There's too many accidents.
Well, I would say it's just unbelievable that you would, if you were not aware of this, then you're incompetent. And if you are aware of it and don't fix it, then that's criminal. I'm sorry.
I think what's happened, I've had some interactions recently with someone running one of these labs. And the world of pathologists and virologists and microbiologists who do the PCR is a different world to the world of whole genome sequencing. So the whole world is using whole genome sequencing to check that their testing's working. So when they have a good sample that's positive, they will send it off and sequence all of the nucleotides to show to show that you've got the whole virus and to create that kind of evolutionary tree that you get to show how the strains develop. So they're saying, well, if the whole genome sequencing is working, we don't need to do our usual checks because that will cover it. That will demonstrate that the test is working. Now, first of all, that's not true. So even if you had the good samples having successful whole genome sequencing, that does not mean that all the bad samples aren't false positives. But also, there are reasons to be concerned that even the good ones that are having whole genome sequencing might be giving us erroneous results. And that's because whole genome sequencing is very dependent on modelling, like the whole epidemic has been. Mm-hmm. People use modelling to make the decisions about whether or not the mutations are meaningful. And they have decided that the mutations are all meaningful. But there are certain aspects of it I'm really uncomfortable with, but nobody will challenge them on it because it's a very egotistical, very difficult science. And the people like me that understand the false positive epidemics are not in a strong position to say, you need to check this better. I've been saying it anyway, but I've been attacked horribly for saying it.
Yeah.
And when I've spoken to the people running the labs saying, why aren't you doing wet testing? They're saying, well, we're doing whole genome sequencing. When I speak to the whole genome sequencing people and I say, why aren't you checking this by trying to make it go wrong? You know, using samples that should not test positive and see if they do. They're like, we don't need to do that. We've got our modeling.
Also es gibt da einen Streit unter denjenigen Wissenschaftlern, die diese Tests wirklich verstehen. Sie gehört dazu, die genau wissen, wie es funktioniert, und denjenigen, die diese Tests nur anwenden. Und offenbar, ich will jetzt keine Details sagen, Wolfgang, wenn du das kannst, mach das, aber und offenbar sehr viele falsch positive Tests bekommen, werden von ihr und anderen darauf hingewiesen, warum überprüft ihr das Verfahren nicht, indem ihr zum Beispiel sicher in Anführungsstrichen nicht positive Sequenzen nehmt und dann feststellt, ob das darauf auch positiv antestet, aber diese Leute weigern sich schlicht. Why do you think this is? Why do they not want to be corrected?
I think it becomes, there's very much a culture that what they're doing is very complicated and very clever and can't be challenged. And that there's a huge amount of complex statistics and complex mathematics behind it. And so they all hold the same beliefs, what it all means. Mm-hmm. Because people haven't checked it experimentally, they don't actually have good evidence for their beliefs.
They only have modeling.
That's very interesting, Claire. That's fantastic, because basically, and I mean this in a flattering way, they are a cult. There are a set of beliefs that only they understand and that are not accessible, say, to people like me, because I don't understand, the details of that. And so they genuinely believe. I think that the answer to your question, Rainer, is I think the people that Claire's talking about genuinely believe what they're doing is correct. But there's a huge but here. I'm a wet biologist. It's what I do. And I'm saying there's lots of wet data that says what you're measuring must be wrong because. And some of the because is second wave, they certainly can't exist with greater ferocity than the first one. Not unless there was something very strange and unusual about this virus. And I've mentioned that this is a really common virus in some ways. So that's not true. Its characteristics are very dull. It's stable. It doesn't change its form like flu does. And it's boring in that it doesn't poison your immune system the way HIV is alleged to do. So this is a virus which, when your body sees it, it's like, I can handle this and you can. And you take a picture of it, snip it up, and you take a picture and you have immunological memory. It's really boring in that sense. So anyone is now going to say that in contradiction to what normally occurs, what we're going to have is not only a second wave, but one that's bigger than the first one. It's no, you've got a measurement error. right? Because the first part requires some serious standing up scientifically. Because I've just told you it doesn't happen. So if you're claiming it does, you need to give me some really good reasons why that might be true this time. And you can't just point to the PCR test, because I say, well, from a practical perspective, as someone who has done, I haven't done this test myself on scale, but I have done mass testing with what's called radioligand binding. Same, and there's lots of ways to go wrong with radioligand binding as well. You just basically, you put the wrong stuff in the wrong tubes, you drop something, your internal standards literally has faded because you've used an old one and it goes off over a period of months and so on. And I've seen them go wrong because I've even done it wrong as a PhD student. You get to the end of a 20-hour day where you've done 10,000 samples yourself manually, and then you put them in the Geiger counter, not Geiger, you put them in the alpha counter, and then you wait for it to come spitting out at the end, and you've got this hollow feeling when you realize the standard curve should be sort of a nice smooth S shape, and it's just you've done something wrong, and that means you have to throw the rest of the results away, which is what I did.
That is exactly what Professor Kämmerer told us, and that has to do with contamination, of course.
Yes.
And that is part of the
operational false positive rate. So I think Claire and I have described how it can go wrong. What we have said accords with what your experts have told you, which is that what is claimed to be happening is just immunologically implausible, should we say. Maybe I shouldn't ever say the word impossible, but immunologically implausible, for which there's no reasons from any source provided to say why this should do something that would be unprecedented. And so you're eventually drawn to, the most likely explanation for all of these different forces is ignorance on the part of the people who did the modelling and a mistake on the part of the PCR testing. And it's happened before, as Claire says, it's happened before. You can go and find the literature references where it's gone wrong. But what I want to do, given the time is short, is invite Claire to describe what we've learned this week.
This week. So
if it's true that the virus has gone pretty much, I'll hand over to
we have a city called Liverpool, and in Liverpool, that's been the hotspot of the second wave. And have had a lot of hospital deaths, not quite as big as the first wave, but significantly similar, and a lot of hospital admissions, and a city that at one point I think was very scared. Then, and their cases were rising, but then these are clever people, and they figured out something was amiss, and they stopped complying with the test. So from the 1st of October, the cases just plummet. And I didn't know if it was that they weren't complying, but actually the percentage of positive has remained constant as it's plummeted. So for some reason, they ran out of people to test. Now, that can happen with false positives if you've got a subpopulation. So say students, you test a student and they're positive. So you test all their contacts and you find another positive. You test their contacts and find another positive. But at some point, you run out of students to test. Anyway, they ran out of cases, but they still had people dying. So they sent in the army. And they sent in the army with a different test. And it's a test that it looks for the protein, so the actual viral particles. And they tested 22,000 people in the first day, and then 44,000 people on the second day. And they're still doing this, like they're trying to test the whole city. They're going into schools testing without parents' consent. They did this. They couldn't find very much. They barely found any at all. So we had a number that the random PCR testing of the population said should be there. So 2.2% or more of the city of Liverpool were meant to have COVID. But when you do this other test, it's not there. They got 0.5%. Now, the government have said that there are 0.3% positives when you try and figure that number out. And when you figure that number out, you do it with really clean-cut situations. Real life doesn't have clean-cut situations. It's full of ambiguity, so you always expect a few more. And 0.5 kind of basically means there's no COVID there.
Yeah.
Accidentally proved it, and nobody really noticed it accidentally proved it.
So in other words, Claire, whatever is happening right now with the numbers of deaths going up, it's not from COVID. because there's no relationship anymore between what the tests are telling us and between what's happening out there not on the streets, but in the hospitals.
That's exactly
Do you have any idea what are these people dying from?
Right, exactly. My next point. So I think what's happened is they increase testing in the hospitals. You get to a critical mass where there's one test for every patient that comes in. And then there are some more tests. So you give the test to the doctors and the nurses, and they think, well, I'm not going to retest the person with a broken leg. I want to retest that person who's dying of respiratory failure, which happens. There's people dying of respiratory failure all the time.
Yeah.
Think, well, we tested them once, but what if we missed it? Because that can happen in a real situation. So they retest the people with dying of respiratory failure and potentially retest again. Yeah. Every time you test, if you include any of those positives as real, you are adding that false positive rate again and again. So we then have this, these mass misdiagnosis in people with respiratory failure. And all we have to do is get that protein test the army used and test these people to prove it's a misdiagnosis.
That would be it. That's all we need to do right now. If we can persuade that, and we're not saying don't do anything else, although I personally think you should turn the damn PCR test off, because once they admitted they don't know its performance, I think it's shocking, because it's having an effect economically. For example, you have to self-isolate for 14 days. And of course, as Claire's pointed out, you end up following people through the diagnostic tree, eventually to death, and then we call them COVID deaths. So this is not a minor mistake that this uncharacterized test is having. But even if you allow it to keep going, as Claire says, we've now got a different test that measures protein, not RNA. It can be administered in the field, and it takes a few minutes instead of hours. And so why not? And of course, the why not will be some people don't want this to end. I don't know who they are and why, but you could easily have ended it months ago by saying, oh, there aren't second waves, which there aren't. Mm-hmm. So someone wants to keep this going. And so Claire is agitating, she's arguing very coherently why you should not just keep testing school kids, but you should really go and test people in the hospital who've got a diagnosis of COVID, because her prediction, and I share it, is, well, no, it's a theory. If we are right that COVID has largely gone, maybe actually gone, then they should find only the background rate, which is about 0.5 maybe. So, yeah, they go and test randomly healthy school children and find 0.5%. Our contention is that's roughly what they'll find in the hospital. But if they find 30%, then I'm completely wrong, and I'm just going to prostrate myself on the floor and say I know nothing, and not comment any further. But I don't think that's what we're going to find. But honestly, people who are sure about this should just be, remember I told you that the PCR tests on a bad day, 11% positive. So it's not ridiculous in hospital to expect 30% of them to be positive. I mean, I think you follow my logic, Claire, that if in the random pillar 2 testing, if 11% are positive, it's not crazy if the test's any good. To follow down to intensive care, you would expect maybe 30% to be positive.
It's a matter of...
So I wouldn't test all of intensive care. I would test the patients who have been diagnosed with COVID.
Yeah.
There's an argument that these tests don't pick up every case.
One question. If you would forget about all those COVID-19 testing and start testing in a hospital now for influenza, you only think of influenza and go to the hospital and test them all with PCR test influenza. What would you find?
Actually, you wouldn't find much. It's a very small window to diagnose influenza. You have to catch influenza at the very beginning of the infection. And so all the delay with waiting to get a COVID result, nobody's getting tested for influenza until it's too late to get a positive influenza test.
We don't think of influenza anymore. We don't test influenza.
No,
exactly right.
We know we have double infection. We know many of the infections are with influenza and COVID and others in the same time. We know it.
Yes.
We don't look at them. We put everything to COVID-19. If somebody dies with the virus, in fact, we have not looked for the other viruses. We just were focusing on. So we're going completely wrong. Because it is a very, very big attention bias we are just following now.
Yes, no, we agree. We agree completely. And I think what Claire has provided to me, and I didn't know this, Wolfgang, I didn't know because I'd never looked at this, that the window for testing it apparently is quite early in the development in an individual of the disease. And if you wait 1 week or maybe 10 days, waiting for the COVID test to come back and maybe repeating the COVID test and waiting for the second result, I think Claire is telling me that your chance of getting a successful read on a flu test is now reduced. In which case, that's why flu has gone, not because it's gone, but because we've stopped testing for it. It's not in the front of our mind. And then when a responsible physician says, hold on, this probably is flu, then Claire says, in many cases, it will be too late to detect it.
I've one question that has crossed my mind in the past days when we were talking about vaccines now getting into the scene. Imagine we're now at a point where we get like, I don't know, a couple of million people injected with a vaccine. If I inject someone with a vaccine that's against SARS-CoV-2 and then perform a PCR, would that PCR test probably come back positive?
I don't know.
Okay.
Claire, do you know?
I don't know. I mean, we did play with that hypothesis a bit, and it may explain some of them. But as I was saying before, there's so many different causes, so it wouldn't explain this higher rate in the men than the women.
No, I think the question is more about the future. Do we know whether the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines that are being considered? Do we know? I don't know. I'm not even sure if it can be answered. But I think, are they not some of them RNA?
Yeah.
Yeah, they are. The Pfizer ones are RNA, for
Okay,
sure.
so
yeah, that's a very important.
We want to know the answer. We don't know, and we would want to know the answer because, my God, if there was even a slight possibility of overlap, that would be bad. But please, this happens all.
Trials.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. It should be in the trials. I've noticed this even with close friends. People I believe I've just persuaded of something, and then they'll suddenly start having a conversation about COVID deaths. It's an astonishing thing. I've spent an hour talking to someone I know and respect who's a scientist in a different discipline, and I really think I've just persuaded them that there's strong evidence of a problem with the diagnostic PCR test, and you show them the deaths, and there is an excess, but Claire hasn't had a chance to fully describe this, but I think in short form, Claire, you've said that when I was having brief pathology lessons, not very many because I'm not a pathologist, the person used to keep telling me you should look into the face of the patient. In other words, it was a short form for saying, for God's sake, look at the patient, because we don't. We often look at the results. So it was like, look in the face of the patient. And Claire has told me that essentially the clinical picture is probably a better phrase. Clinical picture attending the deaths that she's studied in the autumn are not right for COVID, and they're very different from the clinical picture associated with the many spring deaths. And that's shocking. And then when I said, well, who are they? And she said, well, I think they're ordinary members of the public who are dying possibly in larger numbers because of reduced access to the health service. I mean, that's just appalling. That's what's motivated me to work all hours, because if what we've said is true, there are, 100 people a day dying unnecessarily, and it will keep going until we damn well stop them.
They're dying of heart attacks, they're dying of appendicitis, which is
and untreated diabetes and strokes that have not been treated.
And people anyone's got a cough or a fever, with something else, and they phone for help, I'm dying, and they're told, you need to stay at home.
I know. So people are actually dying in our country because there's such a focus on COVID that they are basically now disregarding their Hippocratic oath in about 5 different ways, and they're not being picked up in ambulances. The triage instruction is not to bring such certain people in, and it's like 1930. People are dying before the health service was invented. They're dying at home, unattended, and they're going, oh, look, second wave, look at all these excess deaths, Mike, you're wrong. And I think, for God's sake, why don't you look at the face of the patient? They should be dying of, surely, this is a severe acute respiratory syndrome virus, don't you? So then they ought to be dying with, certainly, a lot of them should be dying with significant respiratory symptoms preceding the illness that led to their death. For example, the kind of symptoms that would lead patients to want to go to the emergency room. And Claire has just told you that the number of people recorded separately as having respiratory symptoms and phoning the health service or the doctors or turning up to the emergency room. We're below normal and flat. So, so we don't have, whatever we don't have an epidemic of SARS-related deaths. We've got something else, and we think we've provided a complete anatomy, a complete description of what's going on. And then we've got the recent findings in Liverpool. So please, when we talked about vaccines, you must know, you don't need vaccines. The virus is finished. Yeah. Now, please don't, when people draw you into conversations about the vaccine, please remind them that by all expectations of immunological theory learned over the last 60 years, it goes through the population, as it did in the spring, turns because we've eroded susceptible people, and it continues to fall until there's none left, right? And then viruses don't do waves. So the second stuff is not COVID, and the explanation is a defective mass PCR test, and it's done on scale because you've been told that there's asymptomatic transmission, so we need to test as many people as possible, as often as possible, forever, right? So don't let people have conversations with you about vaccines. They're clearly not needed. And if you even allow yourself to kind of negotiate with a person about how much is needed, maybe I would say, actually, let me just step back. I would say the vulnerable people, so we know who died in the spring epidemic. And I'm not a pathologist, so I'm not going to guess. But basically, it's the old and very old who are ill and very ill. And very rarely, some young people with multiple underlying disorders. No one else dies. We should not even be thinking of going near these people with a needle with a fairly new biological material. So people say, oh, look, we've got the results. No, you haven't. I've looked at clinicaltrials.gov is an explicit description of the clinical trial protocol. And I've gone in there. This is the first interim analysis. That's what it is. It's an IA. It's a pre-agreed interim analysis. They don't know about illness. They've just studied PCR positivity or not in people who had the vaccine. We know nothing yet about illness. We've only studied a few months post-dose safety, and it's in an age-constrained, illness-constrained group. Now, most people think the vaccine's worked, 90% effective. They think that means 90% of people who got very ill don't get very ill. No, we don't know that. We've no information whatever. So no one has lied to you. That's the impression you've allowed yourself to gather through the media, who themselves don't understand what they just told you. And so people are telling me, well, why wouldn't you take a virus? It's very safe after 6 months. And why wouldn't you take it? It's protecting 90% of the people. Like, it's like, no. But you can just see, I'm terrified that we're going to end up with a mandated vaccine, including people like me and my children. And I'll be told that I'm selfish and thoughtless by refusing it. But the virus is gone, right? As you would expect from a plain, stable, non-immunotoxic virus. I don't think there are any exceptions. So if anyone's got one, they need to tell me. And in the absence of any exceptions, the performance you saw in the spring, the impact of the virus on a population, naive population, is what you saw in every heavily infected country, so like Britain and Sweden and Italy and so on, and then it goes. And all of the second bit is manufactured. Now, I do believe it's even possible it was by mistake, and then there's some errors that have not been corrected. Doesn't matter at this point to me as a scientist. It's just, please recognize that there is discord between the positive PCR test diagnosis and then, as Claire's described, the people who are dying. They don't match. So you can't, whatever they're dying of is not COVID. So let's put a pause on the PCR test, or let's add another test that we've just mercifully got. We've got hundreds of thousands of these tests. Is it millions, Claire, in the country, of these lateral flow tests?
I think it's millions. No, there's a lot.
It's a lot. So they've spent, I think it's 300 million or 200 million. So they're not that expensive. So I think they've bought millions and millions of tests. They've got enough to do the experiment Dr. Craig suggests, which is either in one city or the whole country, go and test people in hospital. It's a non-invasive test, isn't it? It's not very invasive.
Yeah, it's a swab again. But
yeah, so you don't need to puncture anyone. You don't need a blood sample. You could even do it on people who are on intensive care. I mean, you can do it. And if you do it, if we're right, and we think we are, because there's about 9 levels of evidence to say you should be, what we'll find in 3 days is they test and test and test, and we find almost no virus. And then it's over. But if they won't do it, then there's a resistance to doing the right thing. At this point, I emigrate because it's like we're lost.
I need to make my apologies and leave for another meeting.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry.
I need to go too. Do you know what? I think if in a week's time you've got like additional questions we didn't answer, and Claire, if we've got an additional insight that we could give in a more concentrated form, because I've been on the phone and you've been two and a bit hours.
Yeah.
And I worry that we haven't driven the stake through the dark heart of this machine that's still holding our countries around. And I think we could probably do it better together in a few more days or a week. And Wolfgang, I don't think we've killed this thing yet.
That's all right, but we've taken a big step forward. Let's just meet again. But let me translate this, because it is obvious to anyone who listens to you and Claire, and also to Wolfgang, that something is badly wrong, and it doesn't have anything to do with Corona. Claire sagte, es gibt ja in Liverpool wurden Tests durchgeführt von dem Military, ganz andere Tests, die so gut wie gar keine Infektionen mehr gefunden haben. Also seine Conclusion ist, und ihre auch, dass es einfach Leute gibt, die wollen, dass es weitergeht und deswegen künstlich mit Hilfe des PCR-Tests, der sofort beendet werden sollte, wegen seiner ganzen Probleme, künstlich mit Hilfe des PCR-Tests weiter die Illusion aufrechterhalten, als würde hier eine zweite Welle unterwegs sein und daran viele Leute sterben. Sie ist Pathologin und sagt, die sterben nicht daran, sondern die sterben an ganz anderen Sachen. Er sagt, dass die Toten, die jetzt zu zählen sind, überhaupt nicht mehr in Kongruenz zu bringen sind mit den Tests. Sie sterben an anderen Dingen, und zwar zumindest ganz überwiegend oder jedenfalls zu einem großen Teil an den Lockdown-Maßnahmen, an den Maßnahmen, die dazu führen, dass Leute, die Ärzte anrufen, die Krankenwagen anrufen, sagen, ich habe ein Problem, und ihnen wird gesagt, ja, bleib zu Hause und isolier dich, dann wird es schon werden, und die sterben dann. Genau das haben wir auch gerade gehabt. Die Bild-Zeitung hat darüber berichtet. Wir haben das nicht gehabt, wir haben es immer noch. Das sind allerdings die Zahlen, die uns insgesamt von den Mainstream-Medien, genau wie er das ja auch gerade sagt, von den Mainstream-Medien nicht mitgeteilt werden, dass die Schäden, die durch die Maßnahmen eintreten, nicht nur riesengroß sind, was die wirtschaftlichen Folgen angeht, sondern dass hier Leute sterben, und zwar am laufenden Meter, und dass uns das nicht mitgeteilt wird. Okay, Mike, I think this is going to be watched by very many people over and over again, in particular, of course, by the English-speaking world. But I think we have given most of our German speakers a pretty good overview of what is really going on. And you kept telling us, and you wrote in your articles, we have to stop using these PCR tests. It must be stopped. 4 capital letters. Because the only thing that it's useful for is to spread panic.
Yes, that is the effect of it on this occasion. May I just quickly ask, do you know roughly how many videos? Is it 1,000 or is it 1 million? How many people might see this?
Let's see.
I mean, usually on our channel, I mean, we've just been blocked on our main channel, but usually in our channel we get, I think this should maybe be could be 100 to 200,000 viewers. That's only in our channel, and then it's been spread to others, who multiply.
And we're going to make sure this time that, in particular, everybody overseas, in Australia, in the United States, that as many people as possible will catch on to this and will make it known. From one to the other.
And if you could send it to, you probably will, but if you would send it to me and separately to Claire, we each have our own followers on Twitter, and that will add another 100,000 straight away in this country. So
We'll do that.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure and an honor to be able to talk to both of you.
Well, it's the other way around, but if we can help together, that's what we want to do, because we share a similar problem.
Yeah. We have to stick together.
Thank you.
Okay,
yes,
Claire,
thank you.
It was.
Let me just ask you one question. Did you perform some autopsies on COVID people?
No, I'm not actually practicing pathology at the moment. I know that there was a big audit of postmortems that were done in the spring by pathologists that had very characteristic findings. I know that there have been occasional ones done recently as well. Colleagues have told me that too. But, you know, I think we have a bit of low-level endemic COVID in the country. That doesn't mean that we don't have a massive testing problem. Well, and so just to be clear, that pathologists don't just do autopsies. We do diagnostic testing. That's my professional expertise is in diagnostic testing.
Well, we have one pathologist here in Germany who performed postmortems, autopsies in the spring, even though the German RKI didn't want us or the Germans or the German doctors to do it. And the surprising conclusion that he arrived at is that almost no one died of COVID, and almost everyone had passed their average life expectancy, plus had a number of prior conditions. Same thing in Italy, by the way. 94% of the people who they claim died of COVID died of other causes. Same thing in the United States. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. We'll be in touch. We'll do this again.
Yes, okay, we will.
Until it's over. Until it's over. Yeah.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Oh Mann.
Wolfgang,
Ja, Wolfgang, bist du noch da? Haben wir Professor Kämmerer zum Beispiel an Bord?
Ja, Frau Kämmerer ist auch noch da.
Oh, super.
Lass uns noch mal ein bisschen.
Das sollten wir noch mal, genau. Wolfgang, ist da irgendwas Überraschendes für dich gewesen? Ist da was Neues, was wir bisher nicht festgestellt haben? Also diese Sache mit den Operational False Positive Rates, oder das müssten wir auch Professor Kämmerer fragen, entspricht das den Kontaminationen, die durch die Bearbeitung oder...
Wir thematisieren das ja schon die ganze Zeit, zum Beispiel dadurch, dass wir diese skandalartigen, falsch positiven Fälle hatten. Die Fußballvereine lassen sich das ja nicht gefallen, wenn bei denen ein teurer Spieler positiv ist. Ja. Die haben dann fast regelmäßig nachmessen lassen, weil das zu viel Geld kostet, wenn der auch deswegen ausfällt. Und da haben ganz viele Vereine dann jeweils feststellen lassen, dass der gar nicht positiv war. Und wenn wir alle Menschen so nachtesten würden, wie die teuren Fußballer nachgetestet würden, dann wäre der Skandal schon flächendeckend so weit, dass man sagen würde, was soll der Quatsch eigentlich? Ja. Und das Zweite ist eben das, was auch eben gesagt wurde, dass dieser Test jetzt so industriemäßig gemacht wird und überhaupt nicht mehr die gute Laborqualität ist. Ihr wisst ja alle, dieses Augsburger Labor, was dann auch zugegeben hat, dass es nur noch das E-Gen testet, wobei das E-Gen sehr, sehr häufig positiv ist, und dann geben sie das als positiven Test raus. Nach dem Motto, man könnte ja nachtesten. Aber das wird meistens gar nicht mehr nachgetestet. Die Labore sagen, das schaffen wir gar nicht mehr. Wir haben überhaupt nicht genügend Kapazität. Es gibt nicht genügend Leute, die das richtig können. Und wenn man das sieht, diese Massenanlagen, da wird ja überall getestet, auf den Flughäfen, an den Straßen, an den Grenzübergängen. Das sind ja Hilfskräfte, die das machen. Und das kommt da nicht auf die Laborqualität an, sondern das wird gemacht, wird abgerechnet, da wird wahnsinnig viel Geld mit verdient. Und die Politik hat es ja gerne, wenn sie dann durch falsch positive Tests in ihrer Politik bestätigt wird. Das heißt, da meckert keiner, da hat keiner der Verantwortlichen, offenbar, wenn ich mir vorstelle, Herr Söder wäre da kritisch plötzlich und sagte, wir müssen aber nachgucken, ob der Test wirklich in Ordnung ist. Das würde seiner Politik ja total entgegenlaufen. Ja. Die freuen sich über jeden positiven Test, weil sie dadurch in ihrer Politik bestätigt werden. Ja. Und kein Mensch, Robert Koch nicht und das Gesundheitsministerium nicht, die machen nicht mal so eine Qualitätsoffensive, dass sie wenigstens mal diese Frage beantworten, gibt es Unterschiede in der Qualität, allein schon bei der Positivrate. Das ist ja Operational False Positive Rate, ist ja komplizierter noch. Da muss man ja noch mehr machen. Aber hier geht es ja nur darum, die Positive Rate der 180 Labore mal zu vergleichen. Das würde schon so viel Hinweise geben auf unterschiedliche Qualität. Es kann nicht sein, dass ein Labor unter 1% Positive hat oder das Robert-Koch-Institut mit seinen genauen Tests keine Fälle mehr findet. Und woanders werden 10% Positivrate von 10% gefunden. Das haut nicht hin.
Das haben wir gerade, als ich das mit den amerikanischen Kollegen besprochen habe, haben wir genau diese Situation versucht aufzuklären. Jetzt wird es mir endlich klar. Und zwar in New York, wo wir möglicherweise eine der Klagen anhängig machen werden. In New York gibt es benachbarte Bezirke, wo in einem Bezirk 0,5% oder sowas positiv ist und genau nebenan 18%. Das ist nur durch sowas zu erklären.
Natürlich. Das ist so offensichtlich und so für Doofe einsehbar. Da muss man kein Laborfachmann sein. Aber wenn eine und dieselbe Bevölkerung von 2 Laboren mit demselben Test getestet wird, und der eine hat 10-mal so viel Positive wie der andere nebenan, dann kann das nicht an der Krankheit liegen, sondern dann liegt das an dem Test.
Ja.
Und wenn das nicht in Frage gestellt wird, ich meine, das ist natürlich auch für Juristen interessant.
Ja.
Ich würde überhaupt keinen Test, keine Entscheidung, die aufgrund von PCR-Tests gefällt wird, kann man mehr anerkennen.
Ja. Genau das wird das Ergebnis der Klagen sein und der vorangehenden Tests, die in den USA mit den Kollegen da beabsichtigt sind, ohne dass ich da jetzt ins Detail gehen will.
Wir sollten noch mal der Spur nachgehen von der Frau Mrs. Craig da, dass die Frauen und Männer unterschiedlich ergeben haben und Jüngere ein anderes Testaufkommen haben. Das muss ja dann entweder was mit der Entnahme zu tun haben, dass die zum Beispiel alle in so einem Drive-Thru-Ding entnommen werden oder irgendwas anderes.
Die Jüngeren sind getestet worden, massenhaft, als sie aus dem Urlaub zurückkamen. Die Urlaubsrückkehrer, die Massentestung, da war der Altersquerschnitt ja viel jünger als das, was in den Krankenhäusern, in den Altenheimen dann getestet wird. Jetzt, das ist ja, man muss sich die Population angucken, die beobachtet wird durch den Test. Wenn ich die Urlaubsheimkehrer ansehe, dann habe ich junge Leute. Wenn ich da falsch positive Teste habe, dann sind plötzlich all die Jungen infiziert. Und wenn ich bei den Alten dieselben Tests mache und habe da falsch positive Tests, dann sind die Alten infiziert. Das liegt also nur daran, wo dieser unsinnige Test gemacht wird. Dadurch kann ich die Altersgruppen jeweils beschreiben und kriege dann total falsche Bilder von dem, was eine Krankheit machen könnte. Ich will noch was anderes sagen. Man stellt sich, es ging ja auch um die asymptomatischen, die ja angeblich übertragen können sollen. Das ist ja das, was wir vorhin auch besprochen haben. Also die asymptomatischen, hört sich doof an, das sind Gesunde. Das sind Leute, die sind gesund.
Ja.
Wenn du die fragst, also haben sie was? Nö, mir geht's gut.
Ja.
Das sind die Leute und die sollen übertragen können. Wenn die jetzt Viren haben, die man nachweist, wenn da tatsächlich welche sind, wenn nicht nur der Test positiv, sondern da sind welche, da huschen welche über die Schleimhaut, wie Drosten gesagt hat, dann reicht diese Menge nicht mal aus, um die Leute, wo die schon drin sind, krank zu machen.
Genau.
Die können doch erst recht nicht, reicht sie dann aus, um das an andere weiterzugeben. Das ist so ein Blödsinn, das kann sich einer, der auch von Medizin keine Ahnung hat, kann sich das sehr leicht vorstellen, wenn ich gesund mich fühle und bei mir sind Viren. Ja, und? Ich kann die doch niemals jemand anders weitergeben, wenn die sich nicht vermehren bei mir, wenn da nichts passiert, wenn da nur welche gemessen werden. Dann habe ich vielleicht welche irgendwo, vielleicht habe ich im Schlachthof gearbeitet und habe was eingeatmet oder ich weiß, irgendwie sind da welche gefunden worden. Ich fühle mich aber bestens. Aber ich habe dann niemals die Möglichkeit, diese Viren jemand anders anzustecken.
Also
das ist völlig unsinnig.
Wolfgang, die Definition, die Mike Jeden gemacht hat, die hat mich absolut überzeugt. Das ist die Unterscheidung zwischen Hot Infection und Cold Infection. Das ist das mit dem Huschen über die Nasenschleimhaut. Das ist nämlich die Cold Infection, die keine Bedeutung hat. Die Person ist gesund.
Fang nicht an, das Infection zu nennen. Das ist keine Infektion.
Ja, okay. Also er hat es versucht so zu definieren, damit man unterscheiden kann, dass man da irgendwas von einem Virusfragment findet, was aber scheißegal ist, weil es weder die Person selbst krank macht, noch natürlich diese Person jemand anderen krank machen kann.
Eine Infektion ist immer eine Reaktion des Immunsystems.
Ja, das leuchtet ein. Also sollten wir vielleicht der Klarheit...
Ist das einfach eine Besiedelung?
Ja, so Besiedelung ist dann aber auch keine Infection. Also ich glaube, Wolfgang hat recht. Wir müssen auch für die Rechtsstreite, wir müssen klar bleiben und sagen, die sind gesund. Die sind gesund.
Das sind Gesunde, die sind vielleicht kontaminiert, die haben an ihrer Kleidung oder auch haben eingeatmet, aber das macht ihnen nichts, sie werden nicht krank, die haben noch nicht mal eine Infektion, das heißt noch nicht mal eine Reaktion des Körpers darauf. Ja. Weil diese Moleküle, das müssen ja gar keine ganzen Viren sein, die der PCR-Test dann findet. Das können ja nur Bruchstücke sein, die überhaupt nicht mehr was machen können.
Bedeutet für mich aber auch, weswegen ich ja auch vorhin gefragt habe, dass wir uns jetzt, auch wenn Mike Eden gesagt hat, dass er den Leuten, die in den Laboren arbeiten, keine Vorwürfe machen will ich auch nicht, aber das bedeutet, dass wir uns juristisch jetzt zunehmend auch an die Labore wenden müssen, weil ich der Meinung bin, da muss ja irgendein Vertrag im Hintergrund stehen. Die fallen ja nicht aus dem Himmel, die Labore, und sagen, ich mache mal hier einen Test. Sondern da kommt einer von der Regierung und sagt, mach mal hier die Tests, ich schicke dir die Proben. Ich bin zunehmend der Meinung, dass wir es hier wenigstens mit einem öffentlich-rechtlichen Vertrag mit Schutzwirkung zugunsten Dritter zu tun haben. Sodass ich subjektive Rechte aus diesem Vertragsverhältnis herleiten kann, dass der Test richtig durchgeführt wird. Weswegen ich auch Ansprüche darauf habe, zu wissen, wie das Labor gereinigt wird, wie die Falsch-Positiv-Rate ist. Und diese ganzen Angelegenheiten habe ich als derjenige, der da getestet worden ist und aufgrund dessen Test ich in Quarantäne gesteckt worden bin, mein Geschäft zugemacht wurde, sonst irgendwas, einen Anspruch darauf, dass sie den Test richtig machen.
Jetzt sollten wir uns die Labore angucken, du hast recht. Ja.
Das ist richtig.
Ja. Ich weiß auch schon wie. Okay. Ja.
Wenn ich zum Beispiel begutachtet werde irgendwo, dann habe ich immer das Recht, mir eine Kopie des Gutachtens schicken zu lassen und das nachzugucken. Ja. Ich habe immer das Recht, Akteneinsicht zu nehmen. Es gibt ganz seltene Fälle in der Psychiatrie, wo man sagt, es schadet den Menschen, wenn sie das sehen. Das wisst ihr, aber das kommt meistens noch nicht mal durch.
Nein, also das ist die absolute Ausnahme. Das ist die absolute Ausnahme. Du hast einen Anspruch darauf, vollständig informiert zu werden. Es gibt die ganz, ganz wenigen Ausnahmen, die einzelfallbeschränkt sind, wo ein Arzt oder ein Labor sagen kann, das ist jetzt zu gefährlich, das wird seine Psyche oder auch seine physische Gesundheit zu schwer beschädigen. Das ist die absolute Ausnahme. 0,001% aller Fälle.
Richtig, man hat ein Recht auf die Befunde, dass man es nachvollziehen kann, nachzufragen, welche Methode verwendet wurde, wer das gemacht hat, das kann man alles nachfragen.
Mhm. Und da kommt der Sache übrigens zugute, dass die Tests nach wie vor freiwillig sind, was ja inzwischen auch die Ämter und alle möglichen, da ziehen sie sich ja inzwischen alle verstärkt drauf zurück. Das fand ich nämlich bei dem, was gerade erzählt wurde, auch sehr bemerkenswert, als diese Tests vom Militär kamen, wo dann gesagt wurde, das sind non-invasive Tests. Ja. Das heißt, die sind auch noch viel, viel einfacher, viel besser.
Aber auch mit Swabs.
Ja, aber die sind im Gegensatz zu PCR, wo man in den Nasenkanal oder den Drachenkanal eintreten muss, das ist nach jeder medizinethischen Definition ein invasiver Test. Ja. Und die sind nicht nur, also sind weniger invasiv und genauer, diese anderen Tests. Da muss man die Frage aufwerfen, warum werden diese Tests nicht gemacht? Genau, warum werden die mir nicht angeboten? Wir müssen ja, wenn ich freiwillig in so einen Test einwilligen will, der invasiv ist, das 25 Infektionsschutzgesetz, da müssen mir ja auch Behandlungsalternativen aufgezeigt werden. Ich muss ja vollumfänglich die Risikoaufklärung bekommen und da muss mir dann auch gesagt werden, es gibt einen Test, der besseres Ergebnis produziert und weniger invasiv ist.
Genau das war ja seine Forderung, dass er sagt, entweder sofortiges Ende der absolut unzuverlässigen und zwischen 94 und 100% False Positives produzierenden PCR-Tests oder eben alternativ diese Tests benutzen. Ja. Oder sogar den zweiten Test dahinter schalten. Das werden wir machen.
Und wenn das Ganze freiwillig ist, dann muss die medizinische Aufklärung dahinter auch eigentlich schonungsloser sein als jetzt in einem Notfall.
Ja. Und das ist nämlich genau der Punkt. Wenn ich einen Anspruch auf eine Risikoaufklärung habe und es eine weniger riskante und genauere diagnostische Methode gibt, dann ist meine Einwilligung in diesen Test unwirksam. Dann kann die damit verbundene Körperverletzung nicht rechtfertigen, weil ich nicht korrekt aufgeklärt worden bin.
Ja, absolut richtig.
Das heißt, jeder einzelne Test, der diese Aufklärung insbesondere mit, deswegen ist der Test möglicherweise ungenau, deswegen könnte ein falsches Ergebnis rauskommen, hier ist der andere Test, das sind die Vorteile, das sind die Nachteile. Jeder einzelne Test, der diese Anforderungen nicht erfüllt, ist im Moment eine nicht gerechtfertigte Körperverletzung.
Ja. Wir haben einen Arzthaftungsfall.
Kann man das über den anderen Test sagen, der dann in Frage kommt, wie der funktioniert und das vielleicht mal erläutern?
Ja, klar. Aber
also er hat ja gesagt, das ist durch die Army, also das sind Dinge, die...
Das wir hier auch haben. Ich denke, das ist dieser Schnelltest.
Ja, das ist ein Schnelltest. Was das ist, wissen wir nicht. Aber
über den hatten wir schon mal gesprochen.
Und weil man versucht, ganz viele zu machen, hat man die Army da eingesetzt. Und wie wir eben dann auch noch nebenher erfahren haben, läuft das auch alles ohne die Einwilligung. Gerade bei den Kindern läuft das komplett ohne Einwilligung der Eltern. Das, was hier auch schon mal versucht wurde, mein Verdacht ist, das wird immer mal versucht, um zu gucken, komme ich damit durch oder nicht. In Aurich. Weißt du das noch?
Die Waldorfschule, Kindergarten.
Und immer mal wieder Testballons
ja, genau.
haben sie steigen lassen.
Testen mal hier, mal da. In England sind sie schon einen Schritt weiter, in Anführungsstrichen. Aber wir kommen immer wieder darauf zurück. Dieser PCR-Test ist das entscheidende Problem. Und das lässt sich wissenschaftlich nachweisen.
Ja, das fand ich, ist ja auch der Erkenntnisgewinn von heute, dass wir ja wieder noch neue Informationen bekommen haben, dass wir wirklich in den Bereich eines wissenschaftlichen Beweises kommen. Dieser Trichter, den sie beschrieben hat, das ist ja vollkommen einleuchtend. Es müsste ja mehr Tests, mehr erkrankte Leute, mehr auf den Intensivbetten geben und nicht mehr Tests, weniger.
Ja. Trichter, Funnel, ja. Mhm. Ja, richtig. Macht keinen Sinn.
Ist denn die Frau Professor Kämmerer da bei Ihnen zu sehen oder ist die, weil es so lang ging, vielleicht jetzt so?
Sie hat ihre Kamera nicht an, aber sie ist da.
Jetzt, ja.
Und haben Sie eben aus den Aussagen, die ja ziemlich, ja, ich würde mal sagen, auch ziemlich beeindruckend, sagen wir mal einfach, ziemlich beeindruckend waren. Gibt es da sachlich Neues, was wir bisher nicht beachtet haben? Wie sehen Sie das mit diesen, wie hat er das genannt, Operational False Positive Rates?
Frau Kämmerer?
Jetzt ist der Ton weg.
Achso, ist das? Aber das lag nicht da dran, oder?
Die Leitung ist instabil oder so.
Nee, jetzt geht's wieder.
Frau Kämmerer?
Ja, vielleicht ist auf Seiten von Professor Kämmerer die Leitung nicht so ganz stabil. Aber das wir kommen ja noch mal zusammen. Wir müssen aufpassen, weil er ist sehr engagiert. Er regt sich sehr auf. Bei dem, was er gesagt hat, hat er einen Grund dazu. Aber wir werden das nochmal machen.
Ja, da ist sicherlich noch mehr. Ich glaube, wir haben heute im Endeffekt nur an der Oberfläche gekratzt von dem, was an der Sache dran ist. Und das ist jetzt schon so eine Menge an Informationen, die muss man ja natürlich auch erstmal verarbeiten. Ja. Und unsere Aufgabe ist es ja dann auch immer inzwischen, das auch juristisch zu bewerten. Aber ich glaube, unsere erste Einschätzung, dass das darauf hinausläuft, dass wir hier sehr bald auch an einen Punkt kommen, wo diese Widersprüche nicht mehr aufklärbar sind. Deswegen war auch meine Frage mit der Impfung, bin ich froh, dass Sie sich da genau die gleichen Fragen gestellt haben, weil man stelle sich vor, nächstes Jahr kommt diese Impfung und die PCR-Tests fallen immer noch so aus, wie sie jetzt ausfallen und wir haben immer noch genau die gleiche Anzahl von Leuten, die erkranken und sterben und Intensivbetten belegen. Und dann wird es natürlich sehr, sehr schwer, das noch weiterhin auf SARS-CoV-2 zu schieben.
Aber Sie werden versuchen, das auf Panik zu schieben.
Ja,
übrigens hat er ganz klar in diesem Paper, was wir unbedingt online stellen müssen, ich gebe dir das gleich mal, oder ich schicke dir lieber eine nicht vollgekrakelte Version, no need for a vaccine. Und zwar ganz einfach, weil wir haben längst Herdenimmunität. Es braucht keinen Impfstoff, sagt er. Deswegen regt er sich so auf. Und noch dazu dieser Impfstoff, der noch nie zuvor, dieser RNA-Impfstoff, der noch nie zuvor benutzt worden ist. Höchste Panik.
Es sind zwei ganz schlimme Sachen, die jetzt passieren. Das erste ist, dass uns eingeredet wird, das ist ein gefährliches Virus, was immer noch unter uns Schaden anrichten kann. Ja. Das ist eindeutig nicht der Fall.
Das ist weg.
Und das Zweite, was uns die Viren Corona-Viren kommen jedes Jahr wieder, aber die sind auch vorher schon immer gekommen und es spricht nichts dafür, dass sie anders kommen oder gefährlicher kommen als die Jahre zuvor. Das, was wir jetzt sehen, das ist eine Testpandemie. Das heißt, das hat mit den Viren nichts zu tun. Das heißt, es gibt keine Indikation für eine spezielle Impfung, schon gar nicht für eine schnell zusammengeschusterte Pandemieimpfung, die große Risiken mit sich bringt. Das heißt, eine Impfung ist nicht indiziert. Zweitens, die Impfung ist hochrisikoreich. Ja. Von den Ressourcen, die dafür ausgegeben werden, unnötigerweise will ich gar nicht sprechen. Aber diese beiden Gründe, nicht indiziert und hochrisikoreich, die lassen jeden Arzt, der diese Impfung macht und jeden anderen, der veranlasst wird, diese Impfung zu machen, den setzen sie dem Risiko der schweren Körperverletzung aus.
Das mit die Ressourcen, die dafür verschwendet werden, das ist übrigens auch ein Gedanke, über den man sich vielleicht mal ähnlich dem MERS-Virus, das über die Nasenschleimhaut huscht, vielleicht mal durch den Kopf gehen lassen sollte. Wir haben einerseits so eine schlimme, böse Pandemie, dass wir alle Geschäfte zumachen und der Staat weigert sich ja einigermaßen beharrlich, vernünftige Kompensationsregeln aufzustellen. Er weigert sich ja in der angedachten Änderung des Infektionsschutzgesetzes auch relativ beharrlich, die Nichtstörerkompensation mit einzuführen. Aber um Millionen von Impfstoffdosen zu bezahlen, dafür ist Geld da. Da sollte sich einfach nur mal jeder Gedanken drüber machen, ob nicht, wenn wir denn eine schlimme Pandemie hätten, es nicht rechtsstaatlich vertretbarer wäre zu sagen, ich hau meine eigenen Leute raus und du, liebes Labor, vielen Dank, dass du den Impfstoff entwickelt hast. Wir haben eine Notstandslage, ich zahle dir keinen Cent dafür, ich beschlagnahme den jetzt nämlich einfach.
Würde ohne weiteres möglich sein, anstatt die Geschäfte zuzumachen, genau.
Also wenn das alles so schlimm wäre, das wäre nämlich mein erster Gedanke und dann sage ich, ja, ich gebe dir vielleicht später mal, wenn die Wirtschaft wieder läuft, dann gebe ich dir Geld. Aber wenn der Impfstoff wirklich notwendig ist, um uns alle zu schützen, dem würde ich keinen Cent dafür bezahlen.
Das ist der Punkt. Und ich glaube, da spielt die Musik. Follow the money. Mhm. Ja.
Frau Kämmerer, haben Sie noch einen Gedanken dazu von dem, was wir heute gehört haben?
Die ist nicht mehr dabei.
Na gut, dann ist da jetzt was.
Eine sehr schwache Leitung, das hat sie mir neulich schon erzählt. Mhm. Okay.
Das ist ja schon der Wahnsinn. Ja, also ich würde sagen, es ging ja jetzt viel länger. Wir verschieben die anderen Sachen. Wir hatten jetzt heute noch also wir hatten heute eigentlich jetzt noch weitere Gäste vorgesehen, aber jetzt ging das Gespräch ja sehr lang und hat uns auch wieder so mit Informationen befüttert. Ich glaube, das müssen wir alles erstmal verdauen. Ja. Und die anderen Themen wären jetzt ein bisschen Bruch dazu. Deshalb würde ich sagen, wir machen das nächste Woche dann entweder in 2 Sitzungen oder in einer kondensierten, längeren Sitzung oder so. Das gucken wir dann einfach mal.
Und das, was wir heute gelernt haben, ich gucke mal, ob wir das am Wochenende da in die ersten Klagen, die ich jetzt selbst erarbeite, mit einfließen lasse. Da ist also die Nummer hier mit den False Operational Dingern da, Operational False Positives, das muss ich nachgucken. Das ist extrem wichtig, scheint mir.
Das ist wirklich gut, ja.
Okay.
Ja, ansonsten, genau, dann würde ich sagen, sind wir am Ende dieser Sitzung.
Wir müssen dafür sorgen, dass das Ding hier wirklich überall verbreitet wird. Ne? Überall. Weil der Mann ist das absolute Schwergewicht hier.
Wir machen auch kleinere Clips jetzt aus den wesentlichsten Aussagen. Das machen wir sehr schnell und würden das dann auch nochmal rumschicken.
Aber Wolfgang, er ist komplett auf deiner Linie. Ne? Er hat ja in jedem Punkt zugestimmt. Das kann kein Zufall sein. Außer ihr seid beide False Positives oder sowas.
Ja, das würde ich vielleicht auch generell noch mal sagen. Ich will nicht schon wieder diesen Begriff des Verschwörungstheoretikers, der Anfang des Jahres rumgeworfen wurde, bemühen. Aber auch da, jeder, der an dem, was wir hier versuchen herauszuarbeiten, Zweifel hegt, der möge sich doch bitte einfach nur einmal hinsetzen und Revue passieren lassen, wer von den Leuten, die Anfang des Jahres diese Entwicklung, die jetzt so genauso stattgefunden haben, prognostiziert haben, Recht behalten hat. Und ich frage mich immer noch, was aus Professor John Ioannidis geworden ist. Den scheint es offensichtlich nicht zu geben, weil der wird ja geflissentlich ignoriert. Der hat ja wirklich komplett alles vorhergesagt, was passieren wird und wird von der WHO zitiert, interessiert auch kein Schwein.
Nicht mal, was die WHO sagt, interessiert noch ein Schwein, solange es etwas Positives ist für die Menschen.
Was das RKI zu großen Teilen inzwischen sagt, ja, Leute mit leichten... Nochmal zur Erinnerung, das RKI, wenn ich mich recht entsinne, hat gesagt, wir sollten auch davon Abstand nehmen, Leute mit leichten Erkältungssymptomen zu testen. Ja. Das ist also, dieser ganze Kram hat sich so verselbstständigt, dass es überhaupt nicht mehr darauf ankommt, was die Leute eigentlich gesagt haben. Deswegen finde ich das eigentlich einigermaßen bemerkenswert. Genau diese Aspekte, vor 3 Monaten saßen wir da, Wolfgang Wodak erzählt was von Sentinel-Praxen und vor ein paar Wochen liest man die ersten Artikel, ja, man könnte ja mal Sentinel-Praxen einrichten.
Aber es ist tatsächlich auch weg, deswegen regt sich Mike Jeden auch so auf. Ja. Es ist komplett weg von irgendwelchen Evidence-Bases. Da ist nichts, keine Tatsachen. Seine PsyOps haben alles übernommen, unsere PsyOps. Ja. Die Leute, die hier meinen, psychologische Warfare zu betreiben. Und das ist übrigens wahrscheinlich auch eine Antwort auf deine Frage, wieso lassen die sich das alles gefallen? Also wieso machen sie die Buden alle zu und die Leute wehren sich nicht dagegen? So ungefähr. Du hast es nicht genauso gefragt, aber meine Vermutung ist, dass diese Psychotypen vorher genau auskalkuliert haben, Wenn ich denen 75% anbiete, da werden sie nicht sofort dran sterben, aber sie werden dran sterben. Die machen aber mit, die wehren sich nicht. Ich bin absolut überzeugt davon, dass das genau so läuft, das Spiel. Das heißt, die hätten sich viel, viel früher wehren müssen, wie wir es gesagt haben. Sie hätten sich viel früher wehren müssen. Für viele ist es jetzt zu spät. Es sei denn, wir reißen das Ruder um und holen uns das von denjenigen, die verantwortlich sind.
Also ich finde auf jeden Fall faszinierend, diese Minutes da, diese Protokolle, die müssen wir uns holen. Ich denke auch in Bezug auf, wahrscheinlich werden da auch Informationen sein über die Leute.
Ich habe sie euch schon zugeschickt.
Hast du
toll.
Toll.
Ja, super.
Klasse.
Weil dann, wir verlinken die auch, dann kann jeder die sich anschauen, weil da wird es ja wirklich auch darum gehen, dieses Skript, ja, also wie das immer so schön gerade im richtigen Moment auftaucht. Und wenn Herr Jeden sagt, dass da auch die Personen genau identifizierbar sind, ja, das ist ja wirklich faszinierend, dann gucken wir auch mal, in was für Verstrickungen die wiederum sich befinden.
Also es ist nur festzustellen, dass auf der anderen Seite, das muss man immer wieder sehen, auf der anderen Seite haben wir es nicht mit einem kohärenten Block zu tun. Im RKI, du hast da oft darauf hingewiesen, Wolfgang, sind sehr viele gute Leute. Der Fisch stinkt vom Kopf, wie man immer so schön sagt. Dieser hier ganz besonders, würde ich meinen.
Auch im Paul-Ehrlich-Institut sind auch gute Leute, die das mit Impfung sehr, sehr skeptisch sehen. Und das ist auch da der Kopf, der anders redet als die Leute, die die Arbeit machen.
Wobei ich ja nicht mal sagen würde, das ist der Kopf, sondern nur so eine Art, ich weiß nicht, Wurmfortsatz.
Wurmfortsatz.
Weil der Kopf hat ja wenigstens noch eine Funktion. Das ist,
jedenfalls irgendwelche Präparate, die an Strings hängen. Ja, okay.
Ja, also ich habe noch zwei Sachen. Also einmal unterstützen wir ja die Bemühungen von der Sarah Lucia Hassel-Reusing, da nach Den Haag zu gehen. Und wir haben das gepostet bei uns, den Aufruf jetzt in Bezug auf die Schilderung von schlimmen Erlebnissen. Da wird jetzt heute noch, werden wir verlinken, eine nähere Anleitung oder eine kleine Übersicht, welche Themen insbesondere, also welche Fragen man sich stellen kann, ob man das erlebt hat, dass man noch ein bisschen mehr eingrenzen kann, ob man da zu diesem betroffenen Kreis gehört. Und da wäre es schön, wenn wir auf Deutsch und auf Englisch eben entsprechende oder schreckliche Erlebnisberichte, natürlich nicht schön, aber wenn sie zumindest dann bei uns anlanden könnten, sodass sie dann eben da in dieses Strafverfahren eingebunden werden können. Und zweite erfreulich, also nicht, das ist nicht allein erfreulich, aber es ist zumindest erfreulich, dass es vorangeht. Zweite Sache, die ich wirklich erfreulich finde, unsere Newsseite ist jetzt endlich fertig. Heute geht sie online, geht über unsere Webseite, da ist das verlinkt und da könnt ihr dann sehen, was sich alles tut. Und wir freuen uns auch, wenn dann Leute Lust haben, uns mit Berichten, insbesondere aus ihren Ländern, zu unterstützen. Da wird eine spezielle E-Mail-Adresse eingerichtet sein, wo man das eben auch schicken kann und dann gegebenenfalls auch mitwirken kann, die Sachen in andere Sprachen zu übertragen.
Also wir machen genau das, was auf der anderen Seite Bobby Kennedy und seine Leute auch machen. Der hat auch einen eigenen News-Kanal aufgebaut, damit all diejenigen, die in den Mainstreams nicht mehr gehört werden, da zu Gehör kommen. Und das machen wir ja auch auf diese Weise. Du hast gesagt, in 9 Sprachen, glaube ich, ne?
Ja, ist in 9 Sprachen, genau. Und vielleicht kommen noch weitere dazu. Und wir werden uns jetzt auch bemühen, nachdem wir hier jetzt diesen, also den ersten Strike von YouTube bekommen haben für das Video von Robert Kennedy, die Impfthematik ist da erstmal gelöscht worden. Und wir sind jetzt eine Woche lang gesperrt, werden wir uns jetzt auch bemühen, eine andere Unterkunft sozusagen für unseren Kanal zu finden.
Das wird, wenn es gut geht, wird das eine international koordinierte Bemühung sein, sodass all diejenigen, die hier ständig von diesen amok laufenden, selbsternannten Meinungsfreiheitswächtern belästigt werden, sodass alle, die auf einen Schlag auf ganz andere Plattformen oder auf eine ganz andere Plattform umziehen, sowohl zur Kommunikation als auch zum Ausstellen von Videos und anderem, wird, glaube ich, eine einheitliche Sache sein, die da angestrengt wird. Vielleicht schaffen wir es schon zum Ende der nächsten Woche, das zu verkünden.
Ja, genau, so schaut es aus. Also viele Dinge entwickeln sich in die richtige Richtung. Hoffen wir, dass das Hauptthema sich auch irgendwann jetzt mal in die richtige Richtung nachhaltig entwickelt und wir vielleicht...
Wichtig ist, einfach immer weitermachen. Nie aufgeben. Niemals aufhören. Wir kriegen die Schweine.
Das ist das Schlusswort und dann wünsche ich ein ersprießliches Wochenende.